They arrest you for a box, not because of what it contains, but because of what it claims, because you said it can store energy that no one else can measure. Because you dared to suggest that life itself is not just biology but electricity, not just chemistry but energy, and that the libido, that unspeakable force Freud opened the door to but then shut it quickly behind him, might be the very thing that keeps the world spinning. So they break down your lab, burn your books, and drag your machines away because ideas, unlike bullets, do not stop when you fire back, and Wilhelm Reich never stopped firing, not until they silenced him with a prison wall and a heart attack, not until they erased his name from psychology, from medicine, from history textbooks, and left only whispers of a man who believed he had captured the energy of the universe in a box. You are born in Austria in the early 1900s, surrounded by snow, shame, and silence. Your mother dies by suicide after an affair. Your father dies shortly after. And by the time you're 17, you're an orphan in the middle of war, surrounded by violence, bodies, and the sound of authority barking orders, which might explain why you never trusted systems, why you never stopped asking what lives beneath the surface of obedience, beneath the polished rituals of psychiatry, beneath the calm of civilized men. And what you find, first in Freud's theories, then beyond them, is the orgasm not as pleasure, not as sin, not as sex, but as a bioelectrical discharge, the core of life force itself, an energy you name orgone, and once you give it a name, you dedicate your life to proving it exists, to harvesting it, to storing it, to weaponizing it, and eventually to getting destroyed for it. You build boxes called accumulators, wooden chambers layered with organic and metallic materials, claiming they can attract and concentrate this invisible energy, this orgone like a biological battery, and patients come, cancer patients, depression patients, and they sit inside, breathe deeply. Some of them feel better, swear by it, some feel nothing, some call you a fraud, but none of them forget it, and you take it further, build cloudbusters that shoot orgone beams into the sky. Claim you can make it rain, and sometimes it does, but when the FDA hears about it, they don't laugh, they panic. Because if what you're saying is true, medicine is obsolete. Weather is controllable, and the government does not own reality anymore. You do, and they can't allow that, so they call your devices medical frauds, label you dangerous, ban the sale of your boxes, ban the shipping of your publications. And when you ignore the court orders, when you continue to speak and build and write, they arrest you. Sentence you to 2 years in federal prison and order all your books, journals, and devices to be burned, and they actually burn them, over 6 tons of material gone. You die in prison in 1957, heart failure they say, just weeks before you're eligible for parole, and your name is removed from academic circles, your theories declared pseudoscience, your machines ridiculed, your writings buried, but you knew that would happen, you wrote about it. You said the emotional plague of humanity would never allow a man to discover a force that bypasses control, that heals without profit, that energizes without wires, and even now, decades later. Some still believe you were mad, others think you were ahead of your time, but no one denies the silence that followed your disappearance. No one questions why a man with only boxes and books had to be erased so completely. Because this wasn't about sex or rain or even science. It was about control, about the idea that a man outside the system could invent a new one, that the human body might hold the key to the cosmos, that energy might come from within, not from wires, not from machines, not from the government. And once you dare to say that power lives in the human core, you become a threat not to science but to authority, and you are treated like a bomb, not a man, banned like a weapon. Not a theory, erased like a virus, not a voice. So now imagine, for a second, sitting inside one of those orgone accumulators, the wooden walls warm from the sun, your breath slowing, your mind clearing, and for the first time in months or years your pain subsides, your body loosens, your chest feels light, and you wonder just briefly whether this might be real, whether he might have been right, whether the very thing we banned might be the thing we needed, whether Wilhelm Reich was not the madman we painted him to be. But the mirror we couldn't bear to look into. Because if life really is energy, and energy cannot be created or destroyed, then where do ideas go when they are banned? Where do thoughts go when they are burned? And what happens when a man tries to capture the soul of the world in a wooden box and succeeds? You walk into a library, the shelves stretch high, the dust is thick, the candles flicker, and the books are chained to the walls, not because someone might steal them, but because someone might read them, because inside these pages are words that question, ideas that doubt, stories that unravel the seams of power. And if you read them, truly read them, you might never kneel again. So the church locks them away, one by one, century after century, title after title, building a blacklist not of sinners, but of thinkers, not of evil, but of curiosity, a catalog so vast it spans from astronomy to anatomy to fiction, and they call it the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, a list so sacred to censorship that it existed longer than most nations, shaping what could be known, who could speak, and what truth was allowed to exist. Begins in 1559 under Pope Paul IV, but the impulse behind it is much older because long before Gutenberg printed the Bible, the Church controlled knowledge not just by preaching, but by limiting access to anything that threatened doctrine. And when books became easier to copy, when printing gave wings to heresy, they panicked, because for the first time in history, truth could spread without permission, and the index was their answer, a list of books Catholics were forbidden to read. Own, print, or translate under penalty of excommunication, and sometimes worse, because this wasn't just censorship, it was salvation through obedience. It was the belief that reading the wrong idea could damn your soul, and therefore, burning a book was an act of mercy, not violence. You find names on that list, names now carved into the walls of modern knowledge. Galileo, banned for saying the earth moves. Descartes, banned for saying I think therefore I am. Rousseau, banned for writing about free will. Pascal, banned for questioning miracles. Copernicus, banned for claiming the sun does not orbit us. And even Erasmus, who was a Catholic priest himself, banned for suggesting reform, for asking whether maybe faith could coexist with reason. And if that sounds tame today, it wasn't then. Because every idea outside the Church's absolute truth was a doorway to chaos, and their job, as they saw it, was to keep the door shut, even if they had to hammer nails into the pages of every book that tried to open it. The index grew with time, revised and updated by a rotating council of theologians known as the Sacred Congregation of the Index, who would debate which books deserved damnation, classify them into categories: heretical, obscene, politically subversive, and sometimes ban authors entirely, meaning everything they ever wrote or would write was forbidden by default. And if a book contained some truth, some value, but also some poison, they would issue an expurgated edition. With the offending paragraphs removed, a kind of lobotomy by ink, leaving the shell of a book without its soul. But this wasn't just a European affair. The index stretched across continents, reaching into schools, monasteries, universities, even the personal libraries of the educated elite. And for centuries, owning a forbidden book could cost you your position, your status, your freedom, sometimes even your life, because censorship does not ask whether something is true, it only asks whether it is dangerous, and in a world where power rests on belief. The most dangerous thing you can do is give someone a reason not to believe. Still, people read them. They smuggled copies through the Alps, hid manuscripts under floorboards, translated banned texts by candlelight, risking everything not because they wanted to rebel, but because they wanted to understand, because once a book is banned, it becomes radioactive, and the human mind, like a moth to flame, cannot resist the glow, and so the index, for all its power, became a kind of reverse map to truth, a guide not to what should be avoided, but to what might actually matter. Over time, the pressure broke. The Enlightenment tore through Europe like a storm. Rationalism began to bleed into science, politics, and education. And by the 18th and 19th centuries, the index began to feel like an anachronism, a relic of a time when control was enforced through silence, but it still persisted, issuing new editions into the 20th century, banning Marx, Darwin, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and even the Encyclopedia Britannica in some versions, until finally in 1966. After over 400 years, the index was formally abolished by Pope Paul VI, not because the Church suddenly embraced freedom of thought, but because it had become impossible to defend the list without also admitting that the Church had lost its grip on the world. Even after its death, the spirit of the index lives on, not just in religion, but in every government, institution, and culture that tries to sterilize reality, that punishes thought crime by suppressing access, that believes people must be PR. Addicted from certain words, certain pages, certain lines of questioning. And though the index is no longer updated, you can still feel its shadow in school board decisions, internet firewalls, book bans in Texas and Tehran, whisper campaigns on social media, and blacklists of disinformation, because the method changes, but the fear remains the same, that the wrong idea in the wrong hands at the wrong time could be more powerful than any army. So you wonder, sitting now with your phone, scrolling headlines, reading about banned authors, controversial podcasts, deleted posts, blocked books, flagged research, and you ask yourself what you would have done in the 1600s if you were caught reading Spinoza by candlelight. Would you have hidden the book? Would you have burned it yourself? Would you have memorized a passage before surrendering it to the flames? Or would you have recited it aloud, knowing it might be the last time anyone ever heard it? Because the index may be gone, but the logic behind it is not. The belief that truth is dangerous, that authority must mediate knowledge, that permission is required to think, still lingers beneath the surface of our systems, and even now the question is not whether books will be banned again, but which ones already have been, silently, algorithmically, politically, and whether the next great index is not carved into leather and Latin, but but coded into search results and shadow bans. Because what good is a library when you never even know what's missing? You are 9 months old, you do not know what fear is, you do not know what a laboratory is, you do not know that the man in the white coat behind you is about to make you famous, or that your fear will become a textbook, that your trauma will be framed as a breakthrough, that the moment you flinch and cry and crawl away from the thing you used to love will be recorded not as cruelty, but as data, and your name will not be remembered, because they call you Little Albert, a code, a pseudonym. A placeholder for ethics that did not yet exist, because in 1920 there were no rules, no limits, no protections, only questions, and you were the answer. They place you on a mattress in the middle of a room, you smile at a white rat they place in front of you. You reach out to touch it, soft fur, harmless eyes, curiosity in your tiny fingers, and then it begins. They let you get close. Then suddenly a loud metallic clang erupts behind your head, a hammer striking steel, a sound so jarring, so unnatural that your entire body convulses in shock. You cry, they document your reaction, and then they do it again. And again and again, rat, reach, clang, cry. Over and over until the rat alone is enough to make you tremble, until just the sight of white fur is enough to flood your brain with terror. And they smile because they have just proven that fear can be conditioned, that the mind is malleable, that even the most innocent infant can be taught to associate safety with danger, comfort with pain, love with panic. The man running this experiment is John B. Watson, the father of behaviorism, a man who believes the mind is a blank slate, that emotion is not mystical but mechanical, that all human experience is just input and output, stimulus and response, and little Albert is his demonstration, his living argument, his experiment made flesh. And for Watson, this is not abuse. This is science, because if fear can be taught, it can also be untaught. If phobias are learned, they can be unlearned, and this, he claims, is progress, the beginning of a new kind of psychology that does not talk about the unconscious, about dreams, about spirits or trauma, but only about behavior, visible, measurable, controllable behavior. But the reversal never happens. Because before Watson gets the chance to undo the fear, to try deconditioning, Albert is taken away. His mother pulls him from the study, possibly because she realized something was wrong, possibly because the experiment ended, but either way, the child is gone, the damage remains, the data is published, and the conclusion is set. Fear is not innate, it is constructed, it is engineered, and no one knows whether Albert ever stopped fearing white things, because follow-up was never part of the plan, consent was never part of the process, and identity was never part of the ethics, because there were no ethics, just a baby, a rat, a hammer, and the cold pursuit of knowledge. Decades later, psychologists and historians search for Albert's real identity, digging through hospital records, birth certificates, tracking down children born in the same hospital around the same time, trying to match photos, timelines, clues, and eventually they conclude that he may have been Douglas Merritt, a child who died at the age of 6 from hydrocephalus, a neurological condition that may have made him even more vulnerable during the experiment, raising questions not just about consent, but about exploitation, about the use of a possibly disabled child for psychological experimentation. And suddenly the story takes on a new tone, not of scientific triumph, but of quiet horror, a case study in what happens when curiosity is severed from conscience. Little Albert becomes a symbol, not just of behaviorism's power, but of its blind spots, of its coldness, of its willingness to reduce a human child to a mechanism, a device, a thing to be programmed and rewired, and though the experiment is still taught in every psychology class, it is usually followed by an apology, a footnote, a lecture on ethics that didn't exist at the time because the experiment changed psychology, but it also haunted it, casting a shadow that never quite faded, reminding us that discovery without empathy is just damage with a clipboard. And you watching this unfold now might wonder whether Albert ever saw another white rat, whether his fear transferred to dogs, to rabbits, to fur coats, to white beards, to anything resembling that moment, whether he had nightmares, flinched at loud sounds, avoided softness, lived with something he never understood, because no one ever explained to him what happened, no one told him he was part of an experiment, no one gave him back his sense of safety, and in that silence, we see the real result, not the data, not the paper, not the theory, but the absence of repair, the absence of care, the lifelong echo of fear created in a lab and never taken away. Because there was no reversal, the experiment ended, Albert was taken away, the conditioning remained, and to this day, we still don't know whether he ever found peace, or whether the white rat kept crawling through his dreams long after the lab lights went dark. You are holding a book, not a weapon, not a manifesto, not a declaration of war, just a novel, fiction, story, characters that do not exist, places that were imagined, a narrative that weaves between dreams and memory, between mythology and migration. But the moment you open it, the moment your eyes fall on the lines, you have already crossed a line, not because of what you believe, not because of what you support, but because someone somewhere decided that these pages are blasphemy. That fiction can insult God, that metaphor can be a crime, and from that moment the book becomes radioactive, its author hunted, its publishers targeted, its readers threatened, because in 1988, when Salman Rushdie published the Satanic Verses, the world changed. The book is not simple, it is a maze, a surreal tapestry of magical realism and post-colonial commentary. Two Indian expatriates fall from a hijacked plane, survive, and take on the forms of the Archangel Gabriel and the devil. It is not literal, not historical. It is a symbolic tale, layered and strange, a novel about identity, exile, religious doubt, and cultural conflict. But one of its subplots fictionalizes the life of a prophet named Mahound. A clear parallel to the prophet Muhammad, and it introduces the idea that some verses in the Quran may have been inspired by Satan rather than God, an old historical controversy long debated by scholars, rejected by mainstream Islam, but revived here in dreamlike fiction, and that is enough to ignite fire. Muslim communities across the world respond with fury. They do not see nuance. They do not see literature. They see insult. They see mockery. They see sacred belief twisted into fantasy. And the reaction escalates quickly. Protests erupt in the United Kingdom. Books are burned in the streets of Bradford. Bookstores are firebombed. People are attacked. And on February 14, 1989, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khomeini issues a fatwa, a religious edict, calling for the assassination of Salman Rushdie, offering millions of dollars for his death. And suddenly a novelist becomes a fugitive, a man sentenced to death not for murder, not for treason, but for sentences he wrote in a novel. Rushdie goes into hiding under British police protection, moving from safe house to safe house, unable to live freely, to speak publicly, to visit family. And though the fatwa is condemned by many governments, it is never rescinded, and those connected to the book begin to suffer the consequences. Hitoshi Igarashi, the Japanese translator of the Satanic Verses, is stabbed to death in 1991. Eder Capriolo, the Italian translator, is stabbed but survives. William Nygaard, the Norwegian publisher, is shot 3 times outside his home and barely lives. Bookstores carrying the novel are vandalized, and anyone defending the book is labeled an enemy, not of a country, but of God. Irony is sharp, because the novel itself is about transformation, contradiction, the fragmentation of faith and identity in a post-colonial world. But the reaction it provokes is primal, binary, absolute, and even within Muslim communities. The book becomes a fracture point. Some defend it as free speech. Others call for its destruction. Some read it secretly. Others never open it but still condemn it. And in the middle of it all is the question no one can answer: can fiction be heresy? Can imagination be punished? Can you be executed not for what you did, but for what you imagined? The backlash spreads, not just through protests but through laws. Countries ban the book officially. India bans it immediately, Saudi Arabia bans it, Egypt bans it, South Africa bans it, Bangladesh bans it, Kenya bans it, Venezuela bans it, Thailand bans it, Pakistan bans it after 5 people are killed in riots. And though the bans differ in form, some legal, some cultural, some violent, the effect is the same. Silence, suppression, fear, and the chilling message that religious sentiment, no matter how rigid or broad, can override artistic freedom, and that blasphemy, even fictional, can be met with real-world blood. And yet the book continues to sell. It becomes one of the most talked-about novels in modern history, not because of its content, which many never read, but because of its consequences. And in that sense, the Satanic Verses becomes more than literature. It becomes a symbol of resistance, of danger, of the tension between secularism and religion, between the right to offend and the right to be protected from offense. And for decades, Rushdie remains in danger, even as the world changes. Even as Iran says the fatwa is no longer being pursued, even as time dulls the shock, until August 12, 2022, when Rushdie is stabbed multiple times on stage in New York, during a public talk over 30 years after the book's publication, proof that some sentences never stop echoing. You sit now, decades later, with the book in your hands, wondering if it's worth reading, if it's worth understanding, or if it's safer not to know, if it's easier to let it be dangerous in theory rather than in practice. But that precisely is the power of the ban, to make something feared before it is even understood, to poison the ground before the seed is ever planted, to turn ideas into landmines. And once that happens, freedom becomes a performance, not a principle, because what use is the right to write if you have to wear a bulletproof vest to do it? And so the question remains, not whether the Satanic Verses is offensive, not whether it crosses a line, but whether we believe that lines should exist at all in fiction, whether art must bow to faith, whether blasphemy should be a crime, whether an idea, wrapped in metaphor, encased in paper, typed by a human hand, should carry the weight of death, and if so, then what else is left to ban? You are not violent, just loud. You are not dangerous, just difficult. You are not mad, just inconvenient. And in the 1940s, that's enough to get you strapped to a gurney, sedated or sometimes not, eyelids clamped open, head held still. A thin, sharp instrument inserted above the eyeball, pushed through the orbit into your frontal lobe, and then rotated left and right like a kitchen knife slicing through fruit. Not to kill you, not to punish you, but to cure you, because this is medicine. This is modern psychiatry. This is the lobotomy, a procedure that promised peace, obedience, normalcy at the cost of personality, memory, emotion, and in some cases, life itself. A procedure so simple it could be done in 10 minutes, in an office, in a hospital, in a back room, and so seductive in its promise that over 40,000 people in the United States alone had their brains partially destroyed in the name of healing. The man behind it is Antonio Egas Moniz, a Portuguese neurologist who in 1935 performs the first leucotomy, drilling holes in the skull and injecting alcohol to destroy white matter in the brain, believing that mental illness is a circuit problem, a loop that must be broken physically. And though the results are crude, he wins the Nobel Prize in 1949, legitimizing the procedure, but it's an American doctor, Walter Freeman, who takes it mainstream, simplifies it, markets it, rebrands it as the transorbital lobotomy, and famously uses an ice pick from his kitchen drawer to demonstrate it, hammering it through the thin bone behind the eye with a mallet, twisting it to sever connections between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain, and calling the results miraculous. Freeman travels the country in a van he calls the Lobotomobile, performing hundreds of procedures himself, sometimes in front of medical students, sometimes for the press, sometimes in psychiatric hospitals so overcrowded that any promise of calm is seen as salvation. And he believes he is saving lives, giving people back to their families, removing suffering, even as patients shuffle out of surgery with vacant expressions, slurred speech, emotional flatness, sometimes seizures. Sometimes incontinence, sometimes death, and yet the demand continues. Because the asylum system is collapsing, the public is desperate, and this miracle of modern medicine is quick, cheap, and approved. They lobotomize women for postpartum depression, children for misbehavior, veterans for trauma, wives for nagging, prisoners for violence, students for rebellion, people who do not fit, who do not comply, who do not calm down, and the procedure becomes less about healing and more about control, not a treatment but a silencing, and the silence is seen as success. Because when the patient no longer screams, no longer fights, no longer cries, the system can call itself merciful. Even though what remains is not the same person, but a quieter version, a muted outline, a brain that no longer resists. By the 1950s, the criticism grows, patients speak out, families begin to protest, horror stories leak into the media, and new medications like thorazine offer chemical alternatives to violence. But Freeman continues, claiming that the lobotomy is misunderstood. And when he is finally banned from performing surgery after a patient dies during her third lobotomy under his hands, he retreats, still convinced of his legacy, still believing he brought peace to the tormented. Even as the rest of the medical community begins to see the truth, that he lobotomized over 3,500 people, that many of them were permanently disabled, that science had turned its back on ethics, and that the promise of control had been stronger than the duty to heal. One of the most famous victims was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy, who at age 23 was described as moody, erratic, prone to emotional outbursts, and at her father's request was given a lobotomy without her mother's knowledge, a procedure that left her unable to speak, unable to walk without assistance, institutionalized for the rest of her life, erased from public memory until decades later. When the truth surfaced and the family's shame could no longer be hidden, and she became the face not just of a medical mistake, but of a generation of women damaged for being inconvenient. The lobotomy is eventually banned or abandoned across most of the world by the 1970s, replaced by medication, therapy, and stricter ethical standards, but it remains a chilling reminder of how quickly science can become violence, how easily medicine can become a tool of conformity, and how the desire to fix people can mutate into a license to erase them. Because when the brain becomes a battlefield and the doctor the soldier, the line between healing and destruction disappears. And silence begins to look like success. And now, looking back, reading the records, seeing the before and after photos, hearing the families describe like going out in a loved one's eyes, you begin to understand what was really banned, not the procedure, not the method, but the truth about what it cost, about how many were mutilated for being too loud, too sad, too strange, too female, too poor, too black, too rebellious, and how long it took for the world to admit that quiet does not mean cured, and that silence, when achieved with a blade, is not peace, but horror dressed in a white coat. You find a scroll buried in the Egyptian desert, sealed in a jar, untouched for nearly 2,000 years, not burned, not edited, not filtered through centuries of translation and doctrine, just preserved raw, and when you unroll it, what you read are the words of Jesus, not stories about him, not miracles, not parables, but direct teachings, sayings, one after the other, stripped of narrative, stripped of context, as if he were speaking directly to you across time. And immediately you notice something is different, because this Jesus doesn't talk about sin or sacrifice or judgment. He doesn't talk about churches or priests or hell. He talks about light, about knowledge, about finding the kingdom of God within yourself. And you realize, as you read, why this book was buried, not because it wasn't true, but because it was too true, too direct, too dangerous to the structure built around him. The Gospel of Thomas is not like the four Gospels you know. It's not a biography, it's not a passion narrative. It doesn't describe Jesus, birth, death, or resurrection. It simply records 114 sayings, fragments of wisdom, aphorisms, some familiar, some startling, some that echo verses in Matthew or Luke, and others that contradict everything institutional Christianity teaches, and nowhere in the text does Jesus say he died for your sins. Nowhere does he mention salvation through blood. Instead, he says things like, split a piece of wood and I am there. The kingdom is within you and outside you. When you come to know yourselves, you will realize you are children of the living Father. And suddenly the idea of God is no longer something external, no longer mediated through church or scripture. It is internal, accessible, personal, and that threatens everything. Because if salvation is found within, then the church is unnecessary. If the kingdom is not coming in the future but already here, then the doctrine of apocalypse loses its power. If light and knowledge are the path to God, not faith or obedience, then the entire machinery of control collapses, and that's why the Gospel of Thomas, though likely written in the 1st or 2nd century, around the same time as the canonical Gospels, was never included in the Bible, never taught. Never translated for mass consumption, instead declared heresy by early church fathers, buried with the rest of the so-called Gnostic texts, and forgotten until 1945, when a farmer near Nag Hammadi stumbled upon a sealed jar of ancient manuscripts. What makes the Gospel of Thomas so unique is not just its content, but its tone. It doesn't argue, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't beg you to believe, it simply presents, and its Jesus is not a martyr or a Messiah, but a teacher, someone urging you to wake up, to look inward, to see the divine spark already inside you. And that message, stripped of ritual, stripped of blood, stripped of fear, was intolerable to a church built on authority. Because you cannot tax someone's soul if they believe it already belongs to them, you cannot dictate morality if people are taught to listen to their inner voice instead of your commandments, and you cannot maintain a hierarchy if every individual is told they are equal fragments of light from the same divine source. The gospel challenges not just theology but power, because its core teaching is that enlightenment comes from knowing yourself, not from confessing to a priest, not from believing in dogma, not from obeying a book, but from direct inner transformation. And for centuries this kind of knowledge, called gnosis, was hunted, banned, and destroyed, not because it was false, but because it bypassed the entire religious infrastructure. And even now, many Christians have never heard of this text. Never been told that there was another Jesus, one who taught that heaven is not a place you go to, but a state of being you wake up to. The suppression of this gospel was not a historical accident. It was a deliberate curation of belief, a choice to define Christianity not through mysticism and self-discovery, but through obedience, sacrifice, and hierarchy. And the Council of Nicaea, centuries after Jesus' death, canonized only 4 Gospels, shaping the New Testament into a singular narrative that aligned with Roman control, leaving dozens of texts, including the Gospel of Thomas, out of the picture. Not because they were less authentic, but because they were less convenient, less useful to those who wished to build an empire in Christ's name. And now, centuries later, the book returns, translated, printed, analyzed, but still quietly controversial, still dismissed by many churches as heretical, still ignored in Sunday school, because its message remains uncomfortably simple. You are the temple, you are the light, you are the key, and that idea, whispered from a desert scroll into the ears of a modern reader, still has the power to dismantle everything built on the opposite. You wonder then what might have happened if this gospel had not been buried, if Christianity had grown not through crucifixion and conquest, but through introspection and illumination, if instead of cathedrals and crusades, it had taught people to sit in silence and search for light within, and you begin to see why it had to be banned, not because it lies, but because it tells the truth too simply, too beautifully, and too freely. Because in a world where the divine is owned, managed, monetized, and mediated, the most dangerous message is this: the kingdom is already here, and you are already enough. You sit in a chair not because you're sick, not because you're violent, but because someone told you that who you are is wrong, that what you desire is abnormal, that love in your case is a disease that must be treated. And the treatment is simple, they say. It's called aversion therapy, just a few sessions, just some conditioning, and afterward you'll be better, you'll be normal, you'll be fixed. But what they don't say is that you'll also be broken, because the goal isn't healing, it's erasure, and the method isn't science. It's punishment dressed in a white coat. It starts with a photo, a film, sometimes just a word, something that reminds you of what you feel, what you're attracted to, and as the image appears, so does the shock or the nausea or the pain depending on the method. Sometimes it's an electric current to your legs or genitals. Sometimes it's a drug that makes you vomit on cue. Sometimes it's both, paired together, timed with precision, so that your brain begins to connect the feeling of attraction with the sensation of punishment. Rewiring your desires not with understanding, but with fear. They call it behavioral correction, they call it therapeutic, they call it progress. And in the mid-20th century it spreads through psychiatric hospitals, military programs, and secret clinics across the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and beyond, targeting mostly gay men, but also women, and anyone whose sexual orientation or gender identity was considered deviant. And the logic behind it is simple and brutal. If you can teach someone to fear what they love, you can make them hate themselves enough to stop acting on it. One of the most infamous examples comes from the United Kingdom, where homosexual acts were still illegal until 1967, and where courts offered aversion therapy as an alternative to prison, a choice that was no choice at all, where patients were strapped down, drugged with emetics like apomorphine, and shown erotic images, forced to associate arousal with waves of vomiting, sweating, convulsing, their bodies betraying them until even the idea of love made them sick, and afterward. They were declared cured, not because they were happy, but because they were afraid. In South Africa under apartheid, a secret military program conducted aversion therapy alongside chemical castration and forced sex reassignment surgeries, attempting to eliminate homosexuality from the armed forces, and hundreds of conscripts were subjected to these experiments, their files destroyed, their names lost, their trauma denied, and in the United States the method was promoted by leading psychologists and funded by public institutions. With research papers presenting the results in charts and percentages, but never in pain, never in the language of suffering, because statistics can hide screams. Even in recent decades, aversion therapy has been rebranded and relocated under the broader term of conversion therapy, often disguised in religious or psychological programs, still used in dozens of countries, still defended by those who claim that identity is a choice, and that punishment is love, and though the methods may no longer involve electric shocks or vomit, the emotional violence remains, the shame, the guilt, the spiritual blackmail, the belief that you must change or be cast out, cured or condemned. And the damage is long-term. Survivors report depression, anxiety, PTSD, dissociation, intimacy disorders, and in many cases suicidal ideation, not because of who they are, but because of what was done to them in the name of who they should be. And countless lives were lost to the belief that love must be corrected, that the soul can be bent with enough force, and that science, stripped of ethics, can be used to crush the human spirit until nothing remains but silence. Medical associations across the world now condemn aversion therapy, outlaw it, apologize for it, but the scars remain, and in some places, the practice continues quietly in unlicensed clinics, in religious camps, in whispered referrals from desperate families. And the myth that queerness is a defect still echoes in courtrooms, in classrooms, in pulpits, and in policies that treat identity as pathology. You think now about how this was possible, how doctors trained to heal could strap someone down and shock them into submission, how psychologists trusted with minds could turn desire into disgust, how society, terrified of difference, could call this therapy, and you realize that the real disease was never in the patients, but in the fear of those who wanted them gone. Because aversion therapy was not about love or science or care, it was about control, about reshaping the world to fit a single mold, about punishing those who made others uncomfortable just by existing. And in doing so, it created not health, but trauma, not clarity, but shame, not transformation, but survival at the cost of authenticity. And now, decades later, when you hear someone say that being different is a choice, or that it can be fixed, or that it should be, you remember the rooms with locked doors, the wires, the vomit, the tears, the silence, and you ask yourself, who really needed the cure. Because if love must be beaten into fear, if truth must be rewired into pain, if identity must be erased to be accepted, then what kind of world are we trying to build, and who are we really trying to save? You read it, and at first it feels like science fiction, like a bizarre dystopia you're safe from, a sterilized world of test tubes, pleasure machines, and cast-engineered humans repeating slogans in their sleep, a place so strange it couldn't possibly exist. And yet as you turn the pages, as the details settle in, a creeping realization forms. It's not about the future, it's about now, it's about you, about comfort being used as control, about pleasure being used as sedation, about freedom being traded for stability, and that's when you understand why this book has been banned, censored, challenged, and quietly removed from shelves since its release in 1932. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too right, too early, and too transparent in what it saw coming. In Brave New World, Aldous Huxley constructs a society that has abolished war, poverty, and disease, but also abolished family, individuality, art, spirituality, and truth. A world where children are grown in artificial wombs, divided into 5 castes before birth, engineered for intelligence or ignorance depending on their social role, and trained through hypnopedia, sleep teaching, to love their chains, to embrace consumption, to fear solitude, and to chant mantras like "everyone belongs to everyone else," and "ending is better than mending," slogans not meant to enlighten but to program. In this world, there are no books outside state-proved manuals, no monogamy, no privacy, no pain, and most importantly, no resistance, because people are not forced into compliance through violence, but lulled into obedience through comfort, with drugs like soma that erase anxiety, with entertainment that keeps minds distracted, with sex that replaces intimacy, and with endless consumer cycles that give meaning through spending instead of thinking. And you begin to realize, as Huxley intended, that tyranny doesn't always wear a uniform. It can come wrapped in softness, smiling, selling you what you want until you forget what you need. And for that, the book is banned. Not everywhere at once, not always permanently, but consistently, repeatedly, across decades and countries, in India, Ireland, Australia, the United States, and Canada, challenged for offensive language, for anti-religious themes, for sexual content, for drug use, and sometimes just for being negative, but always with the same fear beneath, that young people might read it and recognize the mechanisms around them. That they might see the invisible hand that offers pleasure while taking away agency, that they might begin to question the nature of comfort itself, and that they might become harder to pacify. In Mississippi, a school board removes the book because it conflicts with community values. In Ireland, it's banned for its sexual frankness and perceived attack on religion. In India, it is restricted for being seditious. In multiple U.S. states, it is challenged for promoting promiscuity and undermining the family. But the irony is thick, because Brave New World is not promoting those things, it is warning against them, showing what happens when intimacy is replaced with transaction. When pleasure becomes policy, when humanity is flattened into functionality, and when society begins to smile a little too much while asking you to sit down and stop asking questions. The book becomes a kind of mirror, one that no government or institution wants held up to their citizens, because it doesn't show brutality, it shows efficiency. It shows a future where no one is forced to obey, they want to obey. They've been engineered to, psychologically conditioned to, numbed and pacified and pleased into docility, and that is a much scarier image than Orwell's boot in the face, because it's harder to fight, harder to notice, harder to wake up from when the prison is comfortable. Huxley himself understood this, and decades after publishing the novel, he observed that the real danger of the future wasn't censorship through force, but distraction through abundance, that people would not be oppressed by what they hate but seduced by what they love, and that prediction has only grown more haunting as society drifts further into algorithmic pleasures, curated dopamine, passive consumption, and the slow erosion of depth, meaning, and memory. You look around now, and you see soma not in a bottle, but in screens, in apps, in streaming platforms that never end, in curated feeds that remove discomfort, in news cycles that entertain instead of inform, in a culture that rewards noise over nuance, stimulation over reflection, and pleasure over purpose. And you begin to see why Brave New World was so often removed from the classroom. Because the questions it asks are not about science or the future, but about right now. And the answer might be that we've already arrived. So the next time someone bans a book, or removes it from a library, or calls it dangerous or inappropriate or unfit or students, ask yourself what they're afraid of, and then ask yourself whether that fear is already alive in you, whether you too have begun to trade discomfort for ease, truth for peace, meaning for convenience, and whether you, without even knowing it, have begun to live in the world Huxley tried to warn us about, a world where everything is fine, everyone is happy, and nothing is real. You're 6 years old, your shoes don't fit, your hair is crooked, your voice trembles when you speak, and sometimes when you try to say something, the words get stuck, they repeat, they bend, and the other kids laugh. So you get quieter, more careful, and then one day someone sits you down and tells you there's something wrong with you. They watch how you speak, take notes when you stutter, and tell you kindly but firmly that you need to stop talking until you can do it right. And what you don't know is that this is not therapy, this is not school, this is not care, this is an experiment, and you are not a child to them. You are a variable, a subject, a number in a study that will leave you broken. It's 1939, the University of Iowa. Wendell Johnson, a respected speech pathologist, is obsessed with understanding the cause of stuttering, not out of cruelty, but because he himself struggled with it, because he believes stuttering is not biological but learned, a response to anxiety and correction, and to test this theory, he assigns his graduate student, Mary Tudor, to conduct what would become one of the most unethical psychological studies in American history. Later dubbed the monster study not by its creators, but by those horrified by what it did to children who never gave consent and who never knew they were being used to test a theory. The experiment targets 22 orphans from the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home, split into two groups, some who already stutter, some who don't, and instead of treating them, the researchers deliberately try to induce stuttering in half of the fluent children by criticizing their speech, pointing out tiny hesitations, telling them they're starting to stutter, warning them to speak more carefully, creating anxiety around every word they say, and over weeks, these children, who had never stuttered before, begin to falter, to hesitate, to become self-conscious, to avoid speaking altogether, and the researchers call this success. No one is physically harmed, there are no shocks, no drugs, no restraints, just words, just authority figures using tone and suggestion and repetition to damage a child's confidence, to build a cage inside their mind, and it works. The children internalize the criticism, their speech deteriorates, their social behavior regresses, they isolate, withdraw, and some carry the effects for years, for decades, because you can undo physical pain, but shame, once installed in the core of a child's sense of self, can become permanent. The study is never published during Johnson's lifetime, possibly because of the war, possibly because the results were too damning. And the data sits quietly in university archives until the early 2000s, when journalists uncover the details, triggering outrage, lawsuits, and official apologies, but no real justice, because you cannot return a childhood, you cannot uncarve the fear, and the orphans, now elderly, speak of the damage like a ghost that never left, not visible, but always there. In job interviews, in relationships, in silence when they wanted to speak and couldn't. The ethical violation is not just the deception, or the lack of consent, or the psychological harm, it's the selection, vulnerable children, with no parents to protect them, no advocates to speak for them, used because they were accessible, controllable, and disposable. And that is what makes it monstrous, not the data, but the logic behind it, the belief that knowledge is more valuable than well-being, that understanding stuttering justifies creating it. That human subjects can be broken to serve a hypothesis. The study proves what it set out to, that stuttering can be induced through environmental pressure, that the fear of speaking can become the inability to speak, that the mind can be sabotaged with suggestion, and yet that proof came at a cost so high it was buried for 60 years. And even now in speech pathology textbooks, the monster study is often mentioned only in passing, a footnote, a warning, a ghost of how far the hunger for discovery can go when no one says stop. You think now about how easily this could happen again, not with orphans and stuttering, but with new vulnerabilities, new studies, new populations too poor or too isolated or too young to resist. And you wonder whether the ethics committees of today are strong enough to stop the next monster before it's born, or whether it will, as always, take place in the quiet margins of institutions, disguised as help, framed as progress. Until years later, someone digs up the records and realizes what was really done, not to data points, but to people. Because the monster study is not just a story about speech, it's a story about silence, about how easily it can be implanted, how deeply it can root, and how long it can echo in a voice that still trembles decades later, not because the child was broken, but because someone told them they were. You're taken in the night, no one tells you why, no one reads you your rights because there are none, you don't resist because you don't understand yet. You think it's a mistake, that someone will clear it up in the morning. But by the time the morning comes, you are already on a train in a boxcar with no windows, surrounded by others just like you, men, women, students, engineers, clerks, soldiers, some crying, some silent, some already hollow, and that's when you realize this is not an accident. This is the system, and the silence surrounding it is not confusion, it is policy. You are not told how long you will be gone, not given a destination, not given the charges, only a number, a uniform, and eventually a shovel. Because you are going to work, you are going to build things the country needs. You are going to disappear into the largest forced labor system in human history, a constellation of camps stretching across Russia and Siberia like a hidden nervous system, invisible to the outside world, held together by paperwork, guards, cold, and fear. And one day, decades later, a man who survived it all will write it down. His name is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a soldier in World War II, a loyal son of the Soviet Union, arrested for a private letter that made a passing joke about Stalin, sentenced to 8 years in the camps under Article 58 for anti-Soviet propaganda, and later exiled, diagnosed with cancer, nearly dying before he begins to write secretly about the thing no one else dares name. The Gulag, not as a rumor, not as an accusation, but as a mapped reality, a complex, sprawling machine of repression built not by accident but by design, a system so massive and so normalized that it existed in plain sight, denied by everyone, acknowledged by no one. He writes in fragments, in code in his head on scraps of paper hidden under floorboards, passing pieces of the manuscript to trusted friends, burying sections in jars in the woods, memorizing entire pages in case the KGB finds the rest. And what he builds is not a memoir, not a novel, but an archive of suffering, a network of testimonies, letters, court records, smuggled notes, and interviews with former prisoners, tens of thousands of voices filtered through one pen, telling the truth that no one was allowed to say. The Soviet Union was not a worker's paradise, it was a prison disguised as a country. When the Gulag Archipelago is finally smuggled to the West and published in 1973, it detonates like a bomb, not because it was the first time someone criticized the Soviet regime, but because it was undeniable, detailed, meticulous, relentless, naming names, dates, orders, camps, methods, and motives, showing that this wasn't about Stalin's paranoia or bureaucratic excess, but about a worldview that placed ideology above life, obedience above truth, and the state above the individual. And the camps were not the failure of that vision, they were the expression of it. And so the book is immediately banned in the USSR. Not just banned, hunted. The KGB seizes copies, raids apartments, interrogates Solzhenitsyn's typist, Elizaveta Vornyanskaya, who had hidden the manuscript. And days after her interrogation, she is found hanged, a suicide they say, and within a year Solzhenitsyn is arrested, stripped of his citizenship, and deported to West Germany, a Nobel Prize winner without a passport, a Russian who is no longer Russian because in the Soviet logic, telling the truth about the system makes you an enemy of the people. The book circulates in samizdat, illegal underground printings, handwritten, copied, whispered, passed hand to hand like a holy relic, because reading it is an act of rebellion and remembering becomes a weapon. And while Western audiences read it as a shocking exposé, for those inside the USSR it is something else, a mirror that finally reflects the hidden war they lived in, a map of wounds they were told never existed, a voice telling them they were not crazy, not alone, not forgotten. Solzhenitsyn does not write with hatred, he does not scream, he writes with cold, devastating precision. He catalogues the anatomy of state violence the way a surgeon might describe a disease. The arrest procedures, the fabricated confessions, the torture techniques, the hunger, the psychological decay, the absurdity of charges like preparing to commit a thought crime, the quotas for executions, the factory-like efficiency of human disposal, and most chilling of all, the indifference of those who enforced it. Because evil, he says, does not come only from monsters, it comes from ordinary men who convince themselves they are doing their job. And that is what makes the book dangerous. It doesn't accuse one man or one decade, it accuses an entire structure of thought, a system where ideology overrides conscience, where the desire for purity leads to extermination, where the machinery of progress runs on the fuel of silence, and he eyes the line between good and evil does not run between nations or parties or classes, but through every human heart, and the moment that idea is written, the regime knows it cannot be undone. You might think this is history, that it ended when the USSR collapsed in 1991, but the Gulag Archipelago is not just a history book. It's a manual on how power corrupts memory, how a nation can imprison millions and then erase them from the story, how pain can be turned into policy, and how easily people can be taught not to see what's right in front of them. And if you think it can't happen again, it's probably already happening, not with the same name. Not with the same uniforms, but with the same logic. Obedience over truth, comfort over freedom, security over dignity. And even now, the book is banned in parts of Russia, restricted in schools, quietly discouraged in public discourse, because it still burns, it still accuses, and it still demands something that regimes cannot tolerate: memory, unfiltered, unapproved, uncontrollable memory. And Solzhenitsyn knew that was the real battleground, not politics, not economics, but memory, because whoever controls memory controls identity, and whoever controls identity controls what the future will forget. So they tried to erase the book, exile the author, bury the stories, but you're reading it now or hearing about it now, and that means they failed. Because memory cannot be destroyed by banning a book. It only goes deeper, waits longer, and when it returns, it does so with names, with stories, with details sharp enough to slice through the lie. And if you want to know what kind of idea gets banned not just for what it says, but for what it refuses to forget, you need only open the Gulag Archipelago and listen. Because this book does not shout, it testifies, and what it testifies to is simple. The worst crimes don't happen in secret. They happen in silence. You don't know the room you're in, you don't know the date, you don't know why your limbs feel heavy, or why your thoughts feel detached from your body, but you can see the white walls, the clipboard in someone's hand, the flicker of a camera in the corner, and the sensation of something crawling under your skin. And as the light floods your eyes, you try to speak, but the words dissolve before they form because you've been drugged not once, not casually, but methodically, and what's happening to you is not a mistake. Not a side effect, but the objective, because you are inside an experiment that was never supposed to be remembered, and what's being tested is not your blood or your body, but your ability to hold on to your own mind. This is MK Ultra, a secret program created by the CIA in the early 1950s with the purpose of developing techniques for mind control, psychological manipulation, and interrogation through any means necessary. And it begins with a simple fear that communists had discovered a way to control the human brain, to reprogram thoughts, to erase loyalty and implant ideology. And in the paranoia of the Cold War, that fear gives the CIA permission to abandon ethics, legality, and humanity in pursuit of a weapon that can control behavior, suppress resistance, and eliminate truth. The program is approved by CIA Director Allen Dulles in 1953 and is kept hidden from Congress, from the public, and even from many within the agency itself. And under this umbrella, dozens of subprojects are launched, each with its own codename, budget, and victims. And though the details vary, the goal is always the same: to see how far you can push a mind before it breaks, to see whether identity, memory, obedience, even personality can be altered chemically, electrically, or behaviorally. And what that leads to is 2 decades of brutal experiments conducted in hospitals, prisons, universities, and psychiatric wards across the United States and Canada. They use LSD first, not as a recreational drug, not for therapy, but as a psychological weapon, administered to unsuspecting patients, prisoners, mental health patients, students, soldiers, even CIA agents themselves, sometimes with their knowledge, often without, observing the disintegration of thought, the collapse of boundaries between perception and reality, and noting every scream, every panic, every dissociation as data, not as trauma. And the belief behind it is that if you can erase the structure of the mind, you can rebuild it in a new form, and the people subjected to these tests are not given treatment, they are not warned, and they are not given the choice to leave. Some are placed in sensory deprivation tanks for hours, days, sometimes weeks, in total silence and darkness, with no external input, their minds unraveling in isolation. Others are subjected to sleep deprivation or forced sleep for up to 90 days, interrupted only by recorded messages played on loops, tens of thousands of repetitions, phrases designed to bypass the conscious mind and penetrate the subconscious, a method they call psychic driving, and in many cases, it is paired with high-dose electroconvulsive therapy, deliberately erasing memory before attempting to reprogram it with messages chosen by the experimenter. In Montreal, at the Allen Memorial Institute, psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron, funded secretly by the CIA under MK Ultra Subproject 68, conducts experiments on patients suffering from mild anxiety or depression, subjecting them to massive electroshock, high doses of LSD-induced comas, and verbal reprogramming, telling them they are worthless, broken, dead, and trying to rebuild their personalities from scratch, and many of these patients never recover. Some lose their ability to speak, some forget their families, some live out the rest of their lives institutionalized, unable to explain what happened to them, and their families are never told the truth. In prisons like the Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta, experiments are conducted on inmates with the promise of shorter sentences, testing drugs like mescaline, barbiturates, and amphetamines in various combinations, observing their behavior, and in brothels set up by the CIA itself under Operation Midnight Climax, unsuspecting men are brought in, drugged with LSD, and observed through one-way mirrors as prostitutes extract information or test their reactions. And every detail is recorded, not for healing, not for justice, but for control. And what makes MK Ultra so terrifying is not just what it did, but how easily it was buried, because when public attention finally turns toward the CIA in the 1970s, following the Watergate scandal and a wave of whistleblowers, Congress begins to investigate covert programs. And in 1973 then, CIA Director Richard Helms orders the destruction of all MK Ultra files, eliminating thousands of pages of documentation, erasing names, details, dates, and leaving only fragments behind. A few boxes misfiled, a few testimonies from survivors, and a name that would live in conspiracy theories long before it entered history books. The Senate Church Committee in 1975 confirms the program's existence, reveals that it operated without oversight, without consent, and in violation of U.S. and international law, but no one is held accountable, no trials are conducted, and the agency admits only to limited excesses, while survivors are left to piece together their own stories from incomplete records, many suffering from lifelong psychological damage, memory loss, paranoia, and broken lives. And the deeper truth is never fully revealed. How far did it go? How many were affected? And how much of it continues under new names, new budgets, new cloaks of secrecy? Even now, documents continue to surface, hinting at deeper connections to assassination studies, to mass surveillance, to social engineering, and the core question remains unanswered. If the state was willing to dismantle your identity to protect itself, what else would it do in the name of security, and how would you even know when the tools of control are built precisely to make you doubt yourself? You think now about how easy it is to dismiss something that sounds like science fiction, how convenient it is to wave off words like mind control or brainwashing as fringe paranoia, and yet the paper trail is there, the testimonies exist, the admissions are public, and what's most chilling is that the damage MK Ultra caused was not just psychological or ethical, but epistemological. It fractured trust in knowledge itself, in institutions, in memory. And when a society loses the ability to know what really happened, it becomes vulnerable not just to lies, but to forgetting. Because MK Ultra was not just an experiment in controlling people, it was an experiment in erasing the evidence of that control, and even decades later, when the name is known, the details remain smudged, incomplete, redacted, and the victims remain unnamed, uncounted, unhealed. And if you want to know what kind of idea gets banned not because it is false, but because it reveals something unbearable about the truth, look at the history of MK Ultra and understand. The most dangerous secrets are the ones designed to make you forget they ever existed. You're born healthy with a twin brother into a working-class Canadian family in 1965, and at 6 months old, both of you develop a minor issue, phimosis, a common condition easily treated, and your parents, trusting medical advice, agree to circumcision, a standard procedure, nothing dangerous, until the doctor uses an electrocautery device instead of a scalpel, and the current burns through your penis entirely, leaving it unrepairable, gone, and your parents are horrified. Desperate grieving, and then comes the offer, a radical solution from a prestigious expert, a man who says gender is not in the body, but in the mind. His name is Dr. John Money, a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University, famous for his theories on gender identity, a rising voice in the idea that gender is a social construct, that children are blank slates shaped entirely by environment, and he tells your parents that you can be raised as a girl, that surgery and hormones and the right upbringing can make you female, that you will never know the difference, that you will be happy, healthy, normal, and with no other hope. Your parents agree. And at 22 months old, you are castrated and renamed Brenda, and the rest of your life becomes a lie. Dr. Money uses you and your brother as a case study, the perfect experiment, one twin raised male, one twin raised female, a living laboratory to prove his theory, and he documents everything, publishing papers that declare success, citing you as proof that gender identity is malleable, that nurture can override nature, and his work becomes foundational in the field, praised, celebrated, cited for decades. But the reality inside your home is something else entirely. You resist the dresses, reject dolls, fight the identity imposed on you, refuse the name, and by age 6 you are already telling people you are not a girl, but no one listens. Dr. Money continues his sessions, often forcing you and your brother to rehearse gender roles in therapy, including deeply disturbing practices, making you undress in front of each other, inspect genitals, mimic sexual behaviors, and he claims this is to solidify identity, to understand the formation of gender, but what he's really doing is using children to affirm a theory, ignoring the emotional collapse unfolding in front of him, and each time your parents raise concerns, He dismisses them, accuses them of sabotage, insists that everything is working as planned, because admitting failure would mean dismantling the foundation of his career. As you grow older, the distress deepens. You are aggressive, depressed, withdrawn, bullied relentlessly at school for being different. And at 13, after threatening suicide if forced to continue living as a girl, your parents finally tell you the truth, that you were born male, that everything they told you was a fabrication, and you feel the ground beneath you dissolve because your identity was not stolen by trauma or by accident, but by intention, by a decision made in a lab defended in journals. And institutionalized as science. You choose to reclaim your identity, you take the name David, you begin hormone treatments, undergo reconstructive surgery, and try to live as a man, but the damage is irreversible. Your teenage years are gone, your sense of self fractured, your trust in adults destroyed, and your brother, Brian, who also suffered under money sessions, begins to spiral into mental illness, haunted by the same memories, and in 2002, he dies of a drug overdose at age 36, and 2 years later. In 2004, you take your own life with a shotgun blast to the head. The experiment is exposed in the late 1990s by psychologist Dr. Milton Diamond, who tracks you down and learns the truth. And when the story goes public, it shatters the foundation of gender theory built on your case, because the most famous example of gender being socially constructed turns out to be a carefully sustained lie, and the academic world scrambles to distance itself, some continuing to defend Dr. Money, others condemning him, but the damage is already done. To science, to ethics, and most of all to you. What makes this story banned is not just its horror, but its implications, because it challenges the idea that identity can be engineered, that humans are infinitely moldable, that a child's body can be corrected by force. And when that idea is exposed as violence, it threatens entire institutions built on the promise of progress through manipulation. And so the story of David Reimer is quietly omitted, reduced, distorted, used selectively, or ignored entirely. Because remembering it requires confronting the darkest question: how many theories are built not on truth, but on human suffering reframed as data? And you wonder, reading it now, how many other lives have been shaped by ideologies that see people as experiments? How many other children were altered, diagnosed, modified, reclassified, not because the why needed it, but because someone in power believed they should be different? And how many of those children were told that their pain was proof of success? Because David Reimer was not a theory, not a test subject, not a footnote, he was a human being, and his life was not ruined by accident, but by certainty, by the unwavering belief that the mind can be engineered, that biology can be ignored, that the truth can be bent to fit the shape of an idea, and that anyone who breaks in the process is just part of the cost. You enter a building that looks like a science lab, clean walls, quiet halls, polite staff, and you're told you're here to help with a memory study. Something about learning through punishment, nothing dangerous, just a few questions, a few switches, and a man in a lab coat hands you a script, a chair, and a fake shock panel with 30 levers labeled from 15 volts all the way to 450, and he tells you that your role is simple. You ask the man in the other room a question. And every time he gets it wrong, you press the next button, increasing the shock each time, and though you can't see him, you can hear him through the wall, and when you press the first button, he grunts softly, but you keep going. You go to 75 volts, then 90, then 105, and soon his voice is shaking, and he starts to say he doesn't want to do it anymore, says he has a heart condition, begs you to stop. But the man in the lab coat just says, please continue. And when you hesitate, he adds, the experiment requires that you continue. And when you ask who's responsible if something happens, he says, I am, and in that sentence, something inside you surrenders and you keep going. Even as the man screams, pounds the wall, stops responding, goes silent, and you reach the final switch, 450 volts, marked in red labeled XXX, and with shaking hands you press it. This isn't fiction. This is the Milgram Experiment, conducted in 1961 at Yale University by psychologist Stanley Milgram, designed in the shadow of the Holocaust to answer a brutal question. How many people would obey an order to hurt another person if it came from an authority figure? And what he found shook the entire field of psychology, because over 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts, believing they had caused serious harm, even death. Simply because they were told to. No guns, no threats, no uniforms, just a man in a lab coat, calm, clinical, insistent, and that was enough. The man being shocked was an actor, the shocks were fake, the screams pre-recorded, the heart condition fabricated, but the person pressing the buttons was real, the guilt was real, the stress was real, the conflict between morality and obedience played out in real time, And what Milgram showed the world was that you don't need a monster to commit cruelty. You just need a system that tells someone they're not responsible. The backlash was immediate. Critics called it unethical, manipulative, traumatic, and for many of the volunteers they left shaking, sweating, some crying, some unable to speak, horrified by what they had been willing to do. And in later interviews, some participants admitted they had nightmares, that they questioned their own sense of self, and Milgram was condemned for pushing people too far, for showing them the worst in themselves, but he defended the work by saying that what was unethical was not the discomfort it caused, but the reality it exposed, that the same people who mow your lawn, teach your children, sell you groceries, can be led to inflict harm if the instructions are delivered with enough authority. And what made the study so dangerous, so frequently challenged, so quietly banned from classrooms and textbooks was not the specifics of the setup, but the implication that good people, normal people, the kind you sit next to on the bus or smile at in line, will obey evil not because they are evil, but because the structure around them tells them they must. And that idea, that obedience is stronger than empathy, is not one that institutions are eager to promote. The experiment was replicated dozens of times in different countries with minor variations, and the results were always the same. The majority obeyed, the majority followed through, the majority silenced their conscience when someone in charge took responsibility, and over time the data became harder to ignore, and the question became not whether the Milgram experiment was flawed, but whether society could admit what it revealed. Governments and military institutions quietly analyzed the results, not to stop abuse, but to understand how to better control people, because what Milgram had discovered was a blueprint: how to weaponize obedience without force, how to turn moral people into mechanisms, and how to separate action from guilt using nothing but words. And so the story was reshaped, softened, abstracted, taught as a quirky psychological fact, something historical, something academic, detached from the blood and screaming it originally simulated. And in doing so, the truth was dulled, not banned, but sanitized, not denied, but made forgettable, because remembering it properly would mean admitting how thin the line is between us and atrocity. You think now about your own life, the moments when you stayed silent, followed orders, agreed with something you didn't believe in because it was easier, because the person in charge said so, and you wonder if you were in that room, if you were the one holding the switch, hearing the screams through the wall, would you have stopped? Or would you have pressed the button, trembling, afraid, obedient, telling yourself that the man in the coat knows best, that it's just part of the experiment, that you're not really responsible, that you were just following orders? You sign a form thinking it's a summer job, 2 weeks, some easy money, a psychology study at Stanford University, and you're assigned the role of prison guard, just a role, just pretend, and the other volunteers, students like you, are assigned to be prisoners. And they are taken from their homes unexpectedly, arrested by real police, handcuffed, fingerprinted, blindfolded, brought to a fake prison in the basement of the psychology building. And when you arrive for your shift, you put on khaki clothes, mirrored sunglasses, hold a baton, and begin your new job, not thinking much of it, not planning anything cruel, because it's just a simulation, it's not real until it becomes real. At first it's awkward, everyone knows it's fake, but then something shifts, the prisoners start talking back, resisting, and the guards, including you, begin to assert control, not because you're ordered to, but because you want to, because the structure invites it, because you start to enjoy the feeling of power without consequence. And within hours, the atmosphere changes. The guards begin inventing punishments, forcing prisoners to do push-ups, to clean toilets with bare hands, to simulate sex acts, to strip naked, and the prisoners, your classmates, begin to cry, to break, to beg for it to stop, and the researchers just watch. The man in charge is Dr. Philip Zimbardo, a respected psychologist, and he doesn't stop it because he's part of it, playing the role of prison superintendent, watching how quickly normal students descend into sadism, how the uniform transforms behavior, how identity dissolves into role, and his conclusion becomes one of the most famous in psychology, that systems, not personalities, create evil, and that under the right conditions, anyone can become a perpetrator. The study was supposed to last 2 weeks, but it shut down after just 6 days, not because the data was complete, but because it became unbearable, because a graduate student, Christina Maslach, who walked into the basement and saw what was happening, became horrified and demanded it end. And that moment, one outsider breaking the spell is what finally pulls the plug, and the guards, once stripped of their uniforms, return to being ordinary college students, confused by what they did, unable to explain how they crossed the line. The findings become legendary, taught in every psychology course, referenced in textbooks, documentaries, ethics debates. But as time passes, cracks begin to show because participants later say they were coached, that Zimbardo encouraged certain behaviors, that the guards were told to be tough, that the experiment wasn't as spontaneous as it claimed, and critics begin to question not just the ethics, but the validity of the results, and slowly. The Stanford prison experiment shifts from fact to controversy. But even if the details were flawed, the footage is real, the breakdowns are real, the damage is real, and the question remains, what happens when you give someone a role, a costume, a title, and remove the consequences of their actions? The answer, as Zimbardo showed, is that identity dissolves, empathy disappears, and cruelty becomes normalized, not because people are evil, but because the situation allows it, rewards it, expects it, and when structure overrides self, anyone can become a monster. That's what made the experiment dangerous, not just its results, but its implications, because it showed how fragile morality is, how quickly power corrupts, how systems create behavior more than beliefs do, and that's not something governments, militaries, or institutions want widely understood, because it shifts responsibility from individuals to structures, from bad apples to bad barrels, and that threatens the illusion of personal accountability in systems built on hierarchy. Over time, the experiment is banned from replication, not just because of ethical guidelines, but because no university wants to be responsible for unleashing what Zimbardo did, turning volunteers into abusers, turning play into trauma, turning theory into collapse, and the story, though still told, is softened, blurred, framed as history, even though its relevance has only grown as prisons continue to dehumanize, as uniforms continue to erase identity, as roles continue to shape reality. And now you wonder, if you had been in that basement, handed a baton, given power, told to keep order, would you have been the one yelling, punishing, inventing humiliations to make the prisoners comply? Or would you have stood up, said no, broken the script? Because in the Stanford prison experiment, the most terrifying result wasn't that cruelty happened, it's that it happened so easily, so quickly, and so quietly, without anyone needing to be told. You're asked to stay awake, nothing more, no needles, no drugs, no pain, just keep your eyes open, keep moving, keep responding, just don't sleep. And at first it feels manageable. You fidget, you drink coffee, you talk to the researchers, maybe you even feel sharper, like your senses are heightened. But then the edges begin to fray, words repeat in your head without meaning, light starts to buzz against your skull. Your limbs feel like they don't belong to you, and time stretches, collapses, skips, loops. And you realize the experiment is no longer about fatigue, it's about reality itself, and how easily it can be taken from you. Sleep deprivation experiments began as simple curiosity. How long can a human stay awake? What happens to cognition, to reflexes, to mood? But they quickly became something darker, a way to peel back the mind's defenses without chemicals or violence, a tool for interrogation, manipulation, and control. And what they found again and again is that the human brain needs sleep not as luxury, but as architecture, and when it's removed piece by piece, the whole structure falls. One of the earliest known trials took place in 1894 by Russian physician Marie de Manisane, who kept dogs awake until they died, discovering that total sleep deprivation was more fatal than starvation. And by the 20th century, human trials followed, some under the guise of research, others under the weight of military contracts, as governments realized that sleep was not just a biological function, but a vulnerability. And depriving it could dismantle a person without leaving a mark. 1964, 17-year-old Randy Gardner sets a record by staying awake for 11 days, monitored by researchers and journalists. And though he suffers no permanent damage, the symptoms escalate predictably. Mood swings, memory lapses, paranoia, visual hallucinations, and by the end, he's unable to concentrate or hold a train of thought, drifting in and out of clarity, convinced he is not himself. And what this shows is that sleep is not rest, it is restoration, without which the self begins to disintegrate. But the experiments that are rarely mentioned, that are quietly buried, are not the public ones done in labs with volunteers, but the private ones done in psychiatric wards, in prisons, in black sites, where sleep deprivation is used not to observe breakdown, but to cause it, to create confusion, to destroy resistance, to replace thought with desperation. And those experiments, though often unrecorded, exist in testimonies, in documents, in scars that don't show on skin. The CIA's declassified interrogation manuals from the 1960s and onward explicitly list sleep deprivation as a core tactic. Used in MK-Ultra, in Guantanamo, in hidden facilities across the globe, forcing prisoners to stand for days, playing loud noises 24/7, using light and cold and constant stimulation to prevent REM cycles, and within 48 hours most people lose emotional control. Within 72 they begin to hallucinate. And after 5 days, reality becomes a suggestion, not a certainty. In these contexts, sleep deprivation is not about science. It's about erasure, not of memory, but of identity, of resistance, of the capacity to say no. And it works not by breaking the body, but by dissolving the boundary between waking and dreaming, until confessions become meaningless, compliance becomes automatic, and the subject is no longer sure what they believe, or who they are, or what they were trying to protect. And even in civilian settings, sleep is weaponized. Studies on soldiers, on shift workers, on factory laborers show that chronic sleep restriction leads to impaired decision-making, lowered empathy, increased aggression, and in some cases, psychosis. And yet the research is fragmented, often classified, often defunded, because acknowledging the depth of sleep's role in cognition would require structural changes to systems built on fatigue, hospitals, militaries, corporations, governments, and so the deeper results of these experiments are softened. Hidden or ignored. Some reports describe prisoners kept awake for 9 days, strapped in stress positions, denied light or darkness. Some allowed only micronaps followed by immediate reawakening. And when the torture ends, the subjects do not return to baseline. Some develop permanent neurological damage, sleep disorders, paranoia. Some forget their own names. And because the method leaves no bruises, it's often classified as clean, as soft, as acceptable under certain legal definitions of torture. What makes these experiments banned is not the risk, but the implications that consciousness itself is more fragile than we want to admit, that all the things we call personality, belief, identity, are partially scaffolded by the simple rhythm of waking and sleeping, and that when you disrupt that rhythm, you don't just make someone tired, you take them apart. And so the records vanish, the funding dries. Up the studies go unpublished, or sit in archives with redacted names and ambiguous outcomes, and what survives is myth, stories of people driven mad by sleeplessness, urban legends of secret trials, of Cold War projects that turned men into ghosts. And while not all of them are true, the ones that are true are enough. You think now about your own worst nights, about what happens to your mind after 24 hours without sleep, how time distorts, how thoughts stutter, how anxiety amplifies, and you multiply that across days, across weeks, across someone who cannot leave, who cannot say no, and you understand why sleep deprivation was never banned because it didn't work. It was banned because it worked too well, because it didn't kill the body, it killed the boundary between thought and suggestion. Because the human mind is not a fortress, it is a rhythm, and when you break that rhythm, even gently, even scientifically, you don't get truth or clarity or cooperation. You get silence. You are not on trial, there is no courtroom, no gavel, no jury, only a doctor, a form, and a quiet suggestion that if you want to stay out of prison, if you want to keep your job, if you want to see your children, you'll sign the paper and begin the treatment, and the treatment is called therapy, but it doesn't involve talking or healing or understanding. It involves injections, pills, hormones, and over time your body begins to change, not because of illness, but because of a decision made by someone else about what your desire means and what must be done to it. Chemical castration is presented as a medical alternative to imprisonment, a rehabilitative option, a second chance, and yet its purpose is not to rehabilitate but to suppress, to remove libido, to mute attraction, to reduce testosterone to the point where arousal becomes impossible. And while this might seem like a last resort for violent offenders, what history shows is that it was never used only for that. It was used on the vulnerable, the stigmatized, the queer, the inconvenient. Often without consent, often without appeal, and often with irreversible consequences. One of the most famous cases is that of Alan Turing, the British mathematician and father of modern computing, whose work helped end World War II by breaking the German Enigma code, saving millions of lives. And yet in 1952, he is arrested for gross indecency, the legal term for homosexuality in the UK at the time. And rather than go to prison, he is offered chemical castration, an estrogen treatment designed to neutralize his sexuality, and over the next year. His body changes, he grows breasts, his mind deteriorates, his work collapses, and in 1954 he is found dead, an apparent suicide by cyanide poisoning at the age of 41. And his case was not an exception. Between the 1940s and 1970s, thousands of men across Europe and North America were subjected to chemical castration for homosexuality, often as part of court orders, psychiatric diagnoses, or institutional mandates. And in many cases, these were not violent men, not predators, but simply people whose orientation violated the law, the church, or the medical definitions of normality at the time. And the rationale was always the same: that desire itself was a threat. The drugs used vary, most commonly medroxyprogesterone acetate, MPA, or ciprotrone acetate, hormone blockers that reduce testosterone, shrink the testes, eliminate erections, flatten libido, and while the body may survive, the psyche does not, because the side effects are not just physical but existential, including depression, cognitive fog, emotional numbing, anxiety, osteoporosis, fatigue, metabolic damage, and in many cases, permanent loss of sexual function even after the drugs are stopped. Governments have defended the practice as voluntary, but voluntary in the context of a courtroom, of incarceration, of parole, of stigma, is a fiction. Because when the alternative is years in a prison cell or lifetime registration as a sex offender, the choice is not free, it is coerced, and the promise of chemical therapy becomes a euphemism for soft punishment, for medical control dressed as rehabilitation. In the United States, chemical castration laws still exist in several states, applied mostly to sex offenders, but the definitions of who qualifies are broad and inconsistent, and in some jurisdictions, first-time offenders or nonviolent offenders can be pressured into it. And while the public supports it under the belief that it reduces risk, the scientific evidence is unclear, the ethical debates unresolved, and the core question remains unspoken. At what point does state-mandated medication become biological punishment? And beyond legality, there are countless undocumented cases in psychiatric hospitals, in group homes, in treatment centers, where patients diagnosed with paraphilias, autism spectrum disorders, or inappropriate behavior are medicated not to help them, but to eliminate their sexuality, to quiet their impulses, to make them easier to manage, and those cases rarely appear in journals because they're handled internally, with waivers signed under duress or by guardians or not at all. What makes chemical castration so often banned from discussion is not that it doesn't exist, but that it still does, and talking about it forces us to confront how easily modern medicine becomes a tool of control, how desire is still policed not just by law but by prescription, and how the human body remains a battleground for ideologies about purity, risk, and morality. You wonder now how many people took the injection because they were told they were dangerous, even if they had never hurt anyone, how many lost not just their libido but their sense of self, how many walked away from clinics changed forever, not because they wanted to be, but because someone in power decided that their longing was unacceptable. Because when the state enthralls your chemistry, when your desire becomes pathology, when your biology becomes negotiable under threat of prison, that is not treatment, that is erasure, and the silence around it is not consent, it is the quiet that follows when shame is injected directly into the bloodstream. And the question that remains is simple. If desire can be legislated, medicated, extinguished by mandate, what part of you truly belongs to you anymore? You're told it's for your own good, that it will calm you down, restore your balance, ease your anxiety, cure your hysteria, that water heals, that temperature regulates the mind. And as the nurses strip your clothes and lay you down on the table, you try to believe them even as your wrists are strapped, even as your ankles are bound, even as the canvas sheet is wrapped tightly around your limbs, torso, neck, leaving only your face exposed. And then comes the first splash, freezing cold, poured slowly, relentlessly. For minutes, sometimes hours, until your body stops shaking, not because it is calm, but because it cannot move anymore. This is hydrotherapy, once considered one of the most humane treatments in psychiatric medicine, promoted across asylums in the 19th and early 20th century, not as punishment, but as care, as scientific intervention, as a gentle alternative to mechanical restraints or beatings. But what it became in practice was something else entirely. A method of control, of silencing, of punishing disobedience under the name of medical necessity. And the patients subjected to it were not dangerous, not violent, often not even sick, but simply inconvenient, emotional, too loud, too strange, too sad, too female, and once labeled, they were subjected to the cure. Hydrotherapy came in many forms: the cold pack wrap, the hot immersion tub, the continuous shower, the needle spray, each one designed with a clinical purpose, to stimulate or suppress the nervous system, to reduce agitation, to manage mania, and in theory, sessions were to be timed, monitored, adjusted with care, but in overcrowded institutions, underpaid staff, and dehumanizing conditions, the treatments became routine, prolonged, and brutal. In the cold pack method, patients were wrapped in wet, ice-cold sheets, layer upon layer, then covered with dry blankets to retain the chill, and left restrained for hours, sometimes overnight, until their skin turned pale and their breathing slowed, while nurses recorded pulse and response on clipboards, noting compliance as improvement. In immersion therapy, large tubs of water were kept at carefully maintained temperatures, sometimes scalding hot, sometimes near freezing, and patients were placed inside for extended periods, heads supported by wooden rests, bodies submerged up to the chin, movement restricted by weighted lids or canvas straps. And when they tried to leave, they were told that leaving meant the treatment had failed, that failure meant more treatment, and so they stayed, silent, shivering, obedient. Some hydrotherapy techniques used rotating jets of water aimed at the chest or head, sharp bursts intended to shock the nervous system into re-regulation, while others involved alternating hot and cold baths, forcing the body into vascular confusion, and all of this was done without anesthesia, often without explanation, under the supervision of doctors who believed they were practicing science, not suppression. The most infamous use of hydrotherapy occurred at institutions like Bellevue Hospital, Worcester State Hospital, and the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, where entire wings were dedicated to water treatment, where patients were cycled through wet wraps, tubs, and showers like objects on a maintenance schedule, and many patients, especially women, spent months in treatment, sometimes developing infections, skin damage, or hypothermia, with charts listing them as unresponsive, calmer, or in remission, not because they were healed, but because they no longer resisted. Hydrotherapy became a normalized horror, defended by medical journals, taught in nursing schools, regulated by state boards, and rarely questioned, because the alternative was worse, or so they said. And when electroshock and chemical sedation became more fashionable in the mid-20th century, hydrotherapy quietly faded, not because it was condemned, but because it was replaced. But what makes hydrotherapy torture is not just the temperature of the water, it's the system that turned it into ritual, the repetition, the duration, the loss of autonomy, the framing of suffering as recovery, and the way it conditioned patients to associate silence with safety, compliance with survival, and numbness with improvement. To this day, water-based therapy is still used in controlled environments, sensory deprivation tanks, temperature therapy, controlled immersion. But those are by consent, by choice for wellness, not obedience. And yet the history of hydrotherapy remains mostly unacknowledged, tucked away in medical archives, remembered only in patient memoirs, faded photographs, and the architectural remains of tiled rooms with rusted drains and crumbling tubs, where thousands were strapped, submerged, and silenced. You think now about what healing really means, whether it can exist without consent, whether it can be administered through restraint, whether it still counts as medicine when it is done to someone who begs it to stop, and you begin to understand why this chapter of psychiatric history is rarely taught, rarely spoken of, rarely written down in full. Because when you peel away the language, the charts, the protocols, all that remains is a person wrapped in soaked sheets, held down, dripping, cold, and told that their suffering is progress. And in that moment, the line between therapy and torture doesn't just blur, it disappears entirely. You're taken to a room with kind eyes and warm words, maybe by a parent, maybe by a priest, maybe by a therapist who promises to help you live a better life. And they say there's nothing wrong with you, not really, they just want to help you live the way God intended, the way biology intended, the way your community expects, and at first it sounds like love, sounds like care, sounds like they believe in you. But soon it becomes clear that what they really want is not to help you become yourself, but to change who you are, to bend your identity until it breaks into something they can accept. This is conversion therapy, also called reparative therapy, reintegrative therapy, or sexual orientation change effort, a collection of practices designed to eliminate same-sex attraction, transgender identity, or any form of gender or sexual expression that falls outside rigid norms. And though it is often framed as psychological or spiritual guidance, its true mechanism is pressure, shame, and suppression. And it has been inflicted on thousands of people across decades under the false promise that identity can be cured like a disease. Methods vary by time and place, from the openly violent to the quietly coercive in the mid-20th century. It included electroshock therapy, nausea-inducing drugs, forced heterosexual pornography, and aversion conditioning, while in later years it shifted to prayer sessions, talk therapy, group confessions, accountability contracts, and intensive camps aimed at breaking sexual confusion. And in every version, the message is the same, that what you feel is wrong, that what you are is broken, that your truth must be dismantled piece by piece, until only compliance remains. People subjected to conversion therapy are often adolescents, sent by families, churches, or schools who believe they are protecting them, and the harm begins not with electrodes or lectures, but with language words that separate you from yourself, that frame your love as sin, your gender as rebellion, your joy as sickness. And over time, even without physical force, the damage compounds, until you begin to see your own reflection as something that needs to be corrected. Survivors report deep and lasting trauma, depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, substance abuse, loss of trust in authority, dissociation from identity, and internalized hatred that persists long after the therapy ends, and the effectiveness, as measured by actual change in orientation or identity, is near zero, with most professional psychological organizations condemning the practice as unethical, harmful, and unsupported by science. And yet, in over half the countries in the world, conversion therapy is still legal, still practiced, still advertised, sometimes in clinics, sometimes in churches, sometimes in living rooms with a Bible and a promise. And because it often hides behind religious freedom or parental rights, it avoids regulation, escapes scrutiny, and continues to leave behind generations of people who were told they had to choose between being loved and being themselves. What makes conversion therapy so disturbing is that it rarely looks like violence on the surface. It looks like help, like healing, like hope, offered by trusted figures who speak softly, who frame it as a journey of spiritual alignment, who tell you that change is possible, if only you pray harder, try harder, deny harder, and when you fail to change, they say it's because you didn't want it enough, because you weren't faithful enough, because you secretly wanted to be broken. This cycle of expectation and failure becomes a cage, where you are blamed for the injury caused by those who promised to save you, and the silence that follows is deep, because speaking out often means losing the very community that imposed it. And so the victims remain invisible, and the system survives, not because it works, but because it convinces people that they deserved what it did to them. And though some countries and states have banned the practice, loopholes remain, and online programs, religious retreats, and underground networks continue to offer it, rebranded, reframed, but fundamentally unchanged, still rooted in the belief that identity is a mistake, that desire is deviant, and that you can be purified through denial. You think now about what kind of society builds institutions to erase love, what kind of ideology calls it therapy to extract parts of someone they were born with, and how many lives were muted, distorted, or lost because someone believed that conformity mattered more than truth. Because conversion therapy was never about healing, it was about control, about enforcing a narrow image of morality, about making people easier to accept by making them disappear from themselves. And the most dangerous part was not the pain it caused, but the way it convinced people that pain was what healing looked like. You're told it's not real, just a story, just a myth invented by a writer named H.P. Lovecraft in the early 20th century, a fictional grimoire filled with cosmic horror, forbidden rituals, and ancient gods that exist outside of time and sanity, a literary device used to bind together his stories, to suggest a deeper mythology, a secret history behind the curtain of reality. But as the stories spread, as readers become obsessed. As references to the Necronomicon begin appearing in other books, in libraries, in university catalogs, in occult circles, something strange begins to happen. People stop asking if it's real and start acting like it is. Lovecraft wrote the Necronomicon as fiction, but he wrote it like history, giving it an author, Abdul-al-Hazred, a mad Arab poet who supposedly penned it in Damascus in 738 AD. Giving it a timeline, translations, Latin editions, suppressed copies burned by the church, and whispered rituals that unlock contact with incomprehensible forces. And by embedding this fake book inside his stories with such precision, he triggered something unexpected: belief. Soon, readers began asking where they could find it, bookstores received requests, librarians reported missing copies, and in response, fake versions began to appear, some satirical, some serious, some written by occultists who claimed Lovecraft didn't invent the Necronomicon, but channeled it, that the book was real long before he gave it a name, that it exists in other dimensions, accessed not by shelves but by dreams. And what began as horror fiction turned into a forbidden text with a cult of its own. By the 1970s, publishers were printing Necronomicons as actual grimoires, filled with rituals, sigils, summoning instructions, and warnings about the old ones, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, not as monsters, but as ancient beings older than gods, indifferent to humanity, waiting to return, and whether the writers of these editions believed it or not became irrelevant, because the readers did, and belief, even without truth, has power. What followed were waves of bans, censorship, and moral panic. Some bookstores refused to carry it, some religious groups burned it, calling it satanic, dangerous, demonic, even though it was born in fiction. Because fiction, when taken seriously enough, becomes sacred or cursed depending on who reads it, and authorities feared not the book itself, but what people might do with it. The Necronomicon was reportedly found at crime scenes, linked to occult activity, cited in police reports involving rituals gone wrong, suicide notes referencing the mad Arab, graffiti with quotes from the book painted on church walls. And whether these were delusions or performances, the pattern was clear. the book had escaped its creator and now lived in the minds of others. In some countries, the Necronomicon has been quietly removed from libraries or labeled as dangerous content, not because anyone believes it can summon monsters, but because it symbolizes something more powerful. The merging of fiction and belief, the way an invented mythology can become a psychological virus, infecting reality from the inside, bending the boundary between imagination and action. And for those deep in the occult underground, the book is treated with caution, not because it's true, but because it behaves like something that wants to be. Because reading it with full belief has led some into obsession, paranoia, ritual behavior, and even psychosis. And Lovecraft himself, who died poor and unknown, would never have imagined that a fictional book invented to add flavor to his short stories would become the most famous and feared grimoire of the 20th century. What makes the Necronomicon so unsettling is not that it contains ancient knowledge, but that it doesn't, and yet people act like it does, and that reveals something about the human mind, about our hunger for the forbidden, our attraction to the unspeakable, and our tendency to treat books not as objects but as doors, especially when someone tells us we're not supposed to open them. And now you wonder how many people have read the Necronomicon, not to be entertained, but to be transformed, how many whispered the words aloud just to see, how many believed that belief itself could awaken something, and whether that belief created nothing but madness or something worse. Because some books are banned not because of what they say, but because of what people become when they believe them, and the Necronomicon, real or not, behaves like a book that never wanted to be found. You are a Jewish doctor in Vienna born in the 19th century, and you spend your life trying to map the inner world, not with scalpels or microscopes, but with words, with dreams, with slips of the tongue, with the symptoms that speak when the mouth cannot. And over decades, you create something radical. A theory that says the human mind is not unified, that reason is not sovereign, that we are shaped not just by thought, but by desire, fear, repression, and trauma, and your name, Sigmund Freud, becomes synonymous with this new science of the unconscious. You write books that disturb the surface of society, the interpretation of dreams, totem and taboo, civilization and its discontents, arguing that civilization itself is built on the repression of instinct, that religion is a collective neurosis, that childhood shapes everything, that the ego is not the master in its own house, and these ideas are not just controversial, they are dangerous to systems built on control, order, obedience, and purity. And then the Reich rises. In 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, and the Nazi Party begins its campaign to cleanse the culture, to remove what it calls degenerate art, corrupt science, Jewish influence, and anything that challenges the racial, moral, or ideological purity of the new state. And among the first things targeted are books, burned in massive public ceremonies, torching volumes by Marx, Einstein, Brecht, Mann, and Freud. In Berlin's Opernplatz, students throw Freud's works into the fire, shouting slogans about protecting the German soul, and when you hear that your books are burning, you say, with bitter precision, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now they are content with burning my books, but you know what's coming next because they never stop with books." The Nazis ban psychoanalysis, dismantle Freud's Psychoanalytic Institute, seize the assets of Jewish intellectuals, arrest your daughter Anna during a raid, interrogate your colleagues, and destroy the network of thought you spent your life building, not just because you are Jewish, but because your ideas are incompatible with fascism. Because fascism requires the illusion of purity, and you wrote that the human soul is anything but pure. Your theories emphasize complexity, contradiction, ambivalence, the constant negotiation between instinct and civilization, the messy, irreducible interior of the self, and for totalitarian regimes, that's unacceptable because control depends on predictability, on clear roles, on a society that can be shaped from the outside in, not questioned from the inside out. And so the Nazis replaced psychoanalysis with racial hygiene, mental hygiene, Aryan psychology, disciplines that prioritize conformity over curiosity, obedience over introspection, and they label your work degenerate, not just because you are Jewish, but because your ideas give power to the individual, to the subjective, to the ungovernable forces within. You flee Vienna in 1938, after intense negotiation with the help of international allies, allowed to take only a fraction of your belongings, your sisters left behind, 4 of whom will later die in concentration camps, and though you escape to London, you are sick with cancer, exhausted, and in 1939 you die, unable to witness the full horror that will unfold, but having already seen your legacy turned to ash by those who fear what the mind contains. After the war, psychoanalysis survives, even flourishes, but the memory of its banning remains strangely quiet, because the story is not just about Freud. It's about how easily ideas can be erased when they challenge power, and how regimes don't just fear armies, they fear questions, they fear ambiguity, they fear the kind of knowledge that cannot be measured, only understood. Freud's works are now printed in dozens of languages, studied in universities, debated endlessly, but what's often forgotten is that there was a moment in the heart of Europe when his books were illegal, his name was blacklisted, and his entire body of work was declared a threat to national stability. Because to explore the unconscious is to admit that people are not fully knowable, not fully controllable, and not fully pure. And that is what totalitarianism cannot allow. So when his books were burned, it wasn't just about Freud. It was about erasing complexity, silencing doubt, punishing interiority, and replacing it with a mythology of order, of superiority, of simplicity, and that mythology requires empty minds, not minds that dream, that remember, that resist. You think now about how many ideas are still treated this way, not with fire, but with silence, censorship, mischaracterization, and how often the most dangerous thing you can do is not rebel, but simply think too much about yourself, because that thought leads to questions, and questions lead to choices, and choices lead to disobedience. Well, N.D. Freud, for all his flaws, gave people the tools to disobey, not through action, but through insight. And that's why they banned him. You wake up groggy, your body aching, the hospital light too white, too artificial, and you try to remember why you're here, what surgery they said you needed, what forms you signed, if any, what you were told, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, comes back the strange tone in the nurse's voice, the rushed explanations, the way the doctor said it was routine, necessary, simple for your own good, and now your reproductive system is gone, sterilized, sealed off forever, and not because of illness. Not because you chose it, but because someone else, somewhere in an office, looked at your file and decided you shouldn't reproduce. You're not alone, you never were, because the practice of forced sterilization is not rare, not accidental, not isolated to one place or one period in history, but a recurring method of social control used by governments, doctors, scientists, and social workers across the 20th century and beyond to shape populations, reduce what they called undesirable traits, and eliminate people deemed unfit for society, often using the language of science, medicine, morality, and progress. The foundation of forced sterilization is not medical, it is ideological, built on the belief that some lives are worth more than others, that intelligence, morality, success, and health are inherited like eye color or blood type, and that by cutting off the ability of certain people to reproduce, society can improve itself, purify itself, protect itself from degeneration. And while this sounds like something out of dystopian fiction, it was real, it was policy, and it was widespread. In the early 20th century, as eugenics gained popularity among scientists and politicians alike, many countries began legalizing sterilization programs that allowed doctors to operate on patients without their consent, targeting people in mental institutions, prisons, orphanages, and marginalized communities. And in many cases, those affected had no idea it had happened until years later, or never found out at all. Only realizing something was wrong when they tried to have children and couldn't. In the United States, sterilization laws were passed in more than 30 states, leading to the forced sterilization of over 60,000 people, most of them poor, disabled, institutionalized, or non-white, and the legal foundation for this was solidified in the infamous 1927 Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell, in which a young woman named Carrie Buck was deemed mentally unfit and sterilized against her will. With the court upholding the decision in a ruling that included the now infamous phrase, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That sentence was written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., one of the most respected legal minds of his time, and it gave the government the authority to sterilize citizens it found undesirable without their consent, setting a precedent that would remain in place for decades. Carrie Buck wasn't mentally ill, she was poor, institutionalized after being raped and impregnated by her foster family's nephew, labeled feeble-minded to hide the scandal, and used as a test case to justify eugenic policy, and her story is not unique. In California, which led the nation in sterilizations, the program targeted thousands of Mexican-American women, especially those who gave birth in state hospitals, with doctors routinely pressuring them into signing forms during labor, using language barriers, exhaustion, and fear to obtain coerced consent, and in many cases, the forms were forged entirely or never presented at all. In North Carolina, the Eugenics Board operated until 1974, sterilizing people for reasons that included poverty, low IQ scores, mental illness, or simply being considered promiscuous or socially deviant. and often the targets were black women and girls, some as young as 12, told they were getting a vaccination or treatment, only to be permanently sterilized. But the United States was not alone. In Sweden, a national sterilization program operated from 1934 to 1975, sterilizing over 63,000 people, many of them women, and many of them under pressure or coercion, with social workers and doctors framing the procedure as a condition for welfare support, education, or release from institutions. In Japan, under the eugenic protection law, more than 16,000 people were sterilized between 1948 and 1996, including many with disabilities. And in many cases, the decision was made without consent, especially for women labeled as mentally ill or developmentally delayed. In Canada, Indigenous women were sterilized in alarming numbers during the 20th century, especially in the provinces of Alberta and British Columbia under provincial eugenics laws, and even after those laws were repealed, forced and coerced sterilizations continued in hospitals and clinics, with many women being misled, manipulated, or outright lied to about what was being done to their bodies. The logic was always the same: to reduce the burden on society, to prevent the reproduction of traits deemed undesirable, to protect the gene pool, and to shape the future in the image of the present elite. And the methods varied from country to country, but the core assumption remained consistent: that some people should not have children, and that the state, the doctor, the system had the right to decide who those people were. In many cases, sterilization was tied to welfare benefits, with women being told they could not receive housing, food assistance, or medical care unless they agreed to be sterilized, creating a system of economic coercion disguised as choice. And in some cases, particularly in prisons, women were offered reduced sentences or early parole in exchange for agreeing to sterilization, a deal that raises serious ethical questions about consent, power, and bodily autonomy. Even today, the legacy of forced sterilization continues, with survivors coming forward in countries around the world to demand recognition, justice, and reparations, only to be met with bureaucratic denial, legal hurdles, and institutional silence. In the United States, the state of California only began compensating victims in 2021, decades after the program ended, and many other states have never acknowledged the abuse at all. In Canada, lawsuits have been filed by Indigenous women sterilized as recently as the 2000s, with some reporting that they were threatened with the removal of their children if they refused, or told they would not be allowed to leave the hospital until they agreed. These are not ancient horrors. They are recent, ongoing, and often invisible, hidden behind layers of medical authority, institutional power, and the presumption that some lives simply matter more than others. What makes forced sterilization so insidious is that it is not done with open violence, but with quiet paperwork, clinical tools, and the language of care, progress, and protection. It doesn't wear a uniform, it doesn't announce itself as evil, it masks itself as a solution, a public good, a medical necessity, and that's what makes it so easy to ignore, so difficult to expose, and so important to remember. Because behind every sterilization is a story of a person who lost something that cannot be restored, the right to create life, to choose their future, to have a family on their own terms, and that loss echoes not just in their own lives, but in the generations that will never be born because someone decided they weren't good enough to exist. And now you ask yourself, how many people were silenced this way, not with censorship, not with prison, but with a scalpel, a consent form, a procedure done behind closed doors in the name of something called progress? How many futures were erased before they began, and how easily could it happen again in a different form, under a different name, using different justifications, but with the same result: control disguised as care? You speak too freely, you question too much, your ideas don't match the party line, and slowly people begin to notice. Not your friends, not your family, but the eyes that watch, the ears that listen, the bureaucrats who measure speech like they measure wheat, looking for impurity, deviation, dissent, and one day, without warning, they knock on your door and tell you you're not being arrested. Not exactly, you're being examined for your health, for your safety. Because to oppose the state must mean something is wrong with your mind, and that logic becomes the foundation for one of the darkest tools of control in the Soviet Union, the weaponization of psychiatry against political opponents. It begins quietly in the 1950s, grows under Khrushchev, and explodes under Brezhnev, when the KGB and the Soviet psychiatric establishment form an unholy alliance, diagnosing dissenters not as criminals, but as mentally ill, declaring that to disagree with the Soviet system is itself a form of pathology, a symptom of a disease they call sluggish schizophrenia. And unlike normal schizophrenia, which causes hallucinations or delusions. This one has no obvious signs except one, the refusal to conform. You don't need to be violent, you don't need to be incoherent, you don't need to be dangerous, you just need to believe in human rights or speak out about corruption or write something unapproved, and suddenly you are mentally ill. You are not sent to prison, at least not officially. You are sent to a psychiatric hospital, a psychiatric, where you are treated not as a criminal, but as a patient, and in theory this sounds more humane, but in practice it's worse because there is no trial, no sentence, no release date, no due process, only doctors who serve the state, diagnoses that cannot be disproven, and treatments that are indistinguishable from torture. You are locked in a ward with truly ill patients, some screaming, some drooling, some violent, and you are told you belong here, because only a madman would fight the system that feeds him, only an unwell person would criticize socialism, only the mentally ill believe in a reality different from the official truth. They give you drugs, not mild ones, not placebos, but powerful antipsychotics like haloperidol, chlorpromazine, sulfazine, chemicals that cause tremors, muscle stiffness, seizures, blurred vision, fever, full-body spasms, and in high doses coma, and they call this treatment. They call this therapy, but really it is punishment designed to break your will, to erase your thoughts, to reduce you to a compliant shadow of who you once were. And when you resist, they increase the dose or strap you down. Or inject you with insulin to induce hypoglycemic shock, or isolate you in solitary confinement for weeks, or perform electroshock therapy without anesthesia. And when you scream, no one listens, because your screams are proof of your diagnosis. You are not alone across the USSR. Thousands of dissidents, poets, priests, journalists, writers, scientists, and activists are declared mentally ill for believing in democracy, for demanding free speech, for talking about Stalin's crimes, for refusing military service, for handing out leaflets, or even just for reading books banned by the state. And once inside the psychiatric system, you are trapped because recovery means accepting the party line, acknowledging your illness, recanting your beliefs. And only then, maybe, they will consider you sane enough to be released. But if you continue to protest your innocence, if you continue to speak the truth, that is further proof of your condition, and the cycle continues. The most terrifying part is that the Soviet psychiatric system is not operated by monsters in uniforms, but by doctors, many of them educated, many of them truly believing they are helping patients, because the ideology is so deeply embedded in the institution that treating dissent as illness becomes a moral duty, not a crime. And those who do object, the psychiatrists who try to expose the abuse, are themselves declared mentally unstable, stripped of their licenses, imprisoned, or exiled, because in a system where ideology is reality, truth becomes the ultimate psychosis, and the only cure is obedience. International pressure builds in the 1970s and 1980s, as stories of abuse leaked to the West through smuggled letters, interviews with survivors, and the brave work of organizations like the Working Commission to investigate the use of psychiatry for political purposes, which documents hundreds of cases, naming specific hospitals like the Serbsky Institute in Moscow or the infamous Special Psychiatric Hospital in Kazan, where political prisoners are treated with the same drugs used on violent schizophrenics, and over time, the abuse becomes impossible to deny. The World Psychiatric Association threatens to expel the Soviet Union, and in 1983, under growing scrutiny, the Soviets withdraw voluntarily to avoid the shame. After the fall of the Soviet Union, many files are destroyed, many doctors go unpunished, many victims receive no compensation, and the full scope of the abuse remains hidden, blurred by state secrecy and institutional self-protection, but survivors continue to speak, and the pattern becomes clear. Psychiatry was used not to heal, but to erase, not to understand, but to silence, and the hospital became just another prison, only colder, quieter, more plausible to outsiders. And today, in some parts of the world, echoes of that system remain, with political dissent still sometimes framed as mental illness, with diagnoses still used to delegitimize activists, whistleblowers, or journalists, proving that the boundary between psychiatry and politics is not always as secure as we imagine. You think now about the thousands of minds that were drugged into silence, the poems never written, the truths never spoken, the lives stolen not with guns or prisons, but with syringes and white coats, and you realize that one of the most dangerous ideas in the world is that there is only one version of sanity, and that those who see differently must be sick. Because once that idea takes hold, once the state can define what counts as a healthy mind, then all dissent becomes madness, all protest becomes pathology, and all resistance becomes a symptom in need of cure. That is why the Soviet Union didn't just censor books or arrest rebels, It rewired the very definition of normal, turning thought itself into a crime and calling it care. You're born into a world of rules you never agreed to, obligations you never signed, loyalties you never chose, and from the moment you can speak, people begin telling you what you owe to your parents, your nation, your religion, your species, your future children, your conscience, your soul, and then you read Stirner and everything fractures, because he doesn't just question the system, he annihilates the foundation, not with protest or reform, but with a laugh, a scalpel, and a word, ego. In 1844, a man named Johann Caspar Schmidt publishes a book under the name Max Stirner, a book that is not just a critique of authority, but a philosophical explosion titled The Ego and Its Own. And it doesn't argue with religion, it discards it doesn't debate morality, it unmasks it doesn't reject the state. It ignores its right to exist entirely. And in doing so, Stirner doesn't become a revolutionary, he becomes something worse, an untouchable idea. Too dangerous to argue with, too disturbing to acknowledge, and so he is buried not literally, but intellectually, erased not with censorship, but with silence. His premise is simple. You are not born to serve anyone or anything, not society, not humanity, not truth, not God, not even ideals like freedom or justice, because all of those are what he calls spooks, illusions dressed up as truths, ideas pretending to be eternal when they are just tools to control you. And once you realize this, once you stop believing in the sacredness of causes, systems, or values outside yourself, you become free, not metaphorically, not spiritually, but existentially, because nothing owns you. Stirner calls this the union of egoists, not a community built on shared morals, but a gathering of individuals who engage with each other only when it serves their self-interest, and who part ways without guilt when it no longer does. And it is this rejection of fixed identity, loyalty, and morality that makes him more radical than anarchists, more nihilistic than skeptics, and more terrifying to the order of things than any revolutionary of his time. He doesn't believe in human rights because rights are just words others give you, and what others give they can take. He doesn't believe in law because law is just morality enforced by power, and power is never neutral. He doesn't believe in freedom because freedom defined by others is just another leash. And he doesn't believe in society because society is just a collective demand that you live for others. Stirner believes only in one thing, the ownness of the self, the unique, the unrepeatable individual, the one who lives without justification, without submission, without excuse. And for those who run the world, churches, governments, philosophers, this idea is unacceptable because if people stop believing in ideals, they stop obeying them, and if they stop obeying them, the entire structure collapses. That is why Stirner is not debated. He is ignored, omitted, buried under textbooks that mention Marx, Hegel, Nietzsche, but never him. And yet, if you look closely, his fingerprints are everywhere. Nietzsche reads Stirner, possibly even plagiarizes him, replacing egoism with the will to power, wrapping Stirner's explosive rejection in more poetic clothing. Marx dedicates over 300 pages of the German ideology to attacking Stirner without ever naming him directly in the title, trying desperately to refute his ideas while denying him the dignity of full recognition. And even anarchists like Bakunin and Kropotkin are disturbed by his rejection of collective struggle. His refusal to believe in shared emancipation, his cold dismissal of all causes as distractions from self. Over time, Stirner becomes a ghost in the history of thought, present but unnamed, influential but invisible, feared but uncredited. And this is the greatest form of suppression, the kind that doesn't burn books but lets them rot in silence, the kind that doesn't jail thinkers but refuses to teach them. His ideas survive underground, in the margins, in obscure circles of individualist anarchism, in whispers passed through libertarian philosophy, existential rebellion, even in modern internet subcultures that rediscover him without realizing they've found a man who wrote their rebellion 180 years ago. But Stirner is not easy to market because he offers no solution, no utopia, no comforting narrative of justice or equality, only a mirror, and in that mirror there is no higher purpose, no divine plan, no moral arc, only you. And that is why he is banned not by governments but by culture itself, by academia, by the collective mind that cannot function if the individual refuses to believe, because his message is not that the state is evil, or religion is false, or morality is flawed. His message is that none of them matter unless you choose to believe they do, and if you stop believing, if enough people stop believing, they vanish. It is not rebellion that scares power, it is indifference, and Stirner doesn't call for protest, he calls for disengagement, for egoism so pure it cannot be recruited, for autonomy so absolute it becomes invisible to control. You ask yourself now, what happens if someone truly believes nothing is sacred, not even freedom, not even reason, not even resistance. What happens if someone lives without guilt, without duty, without debt to the past or obligation to the future, and whether that person is a danger or simply awake? Because once you read Stirner, you can never fully believe in systems again, not without hearing his laughter behind them, not without sensing that every rule is a suggestion, every cause a leash, and every truth a disguise for will, and in a world that depends on shared belief, that is the most banned idea of all. You begin by talking about responsibility. You mention meaning, structure, tradition, and before long, you're accused of radicalizing people, of promoting hatred, of being the voice of something dangerous. Not because you called for violence, not because you broke any laws, but because your words don't bend to the dominant narrative. And suddenly you're not a professor anymore, not a psychologist, not even a man, you're a symbol, either of salvation or threat, depending on who's listening. Jordan Peterson is not banned in the traditional sense. His books are not burned in piles, his name not struck from libraries, but something more modern happens, something quieter, harder to see, a cultural ban, a reputational purge, where the target is not silenced by law but smeared by consensus, not erased by government but strangled by platforms, publishers, and public pressure. It starts in 2016 when Peterson, a Canadian clinical psychologist and professor at the University of Toronto, publicly opposes Bill C-16, a piece of legislation that mandates the use of gender pronouns under the threat of legal penalty, and while most see it as a simple matter of respect, Peterson sees something else: compelled speech, the government crossing a line from protecting rights to dictating language. He explains his view in lectures, interviews, online videos, and immediately, backlash erupts. He is accused of being transphobic, far-right, dangerous, even though he never says people shouldn't be called what they prefer, only that the state should not force the words out of his mouth. But nuance dies in the heat of controversy, and Peterson becomes a lightning rod for everything the modern progressive left fears: tradition, masculinity, hierarchy, free speech that doesn't flatter collective identities. His lectures are protested, his university is pressured to discipline him, students walk out, activists call for his deplatforming, and soon the campaign spreads. His publisher faces boycotts for printing his books, his social media presence is targeted, his content demonetized, and when his ideas are too complex to ban directly, the strategy shifts: isolate, misquote, reduce, paint him as a gateway to extremism, a danger to youth, a threat to the vulnerable, even though his most famous book, 12 Rules for Life, is a call for personal responsibility, discipline, meaning through order, and a life anchored in honesty, effort, and self-transcendence. His audiences grow not because they seek to dominate the world, but because they feel lost in it, and in Peterson's voice they find clarity, structure, even dignity, and that becomes part of the problem. Because a man helping young people find meaning outside of ideological movements threatens those movements, not by attack, but by offering an alternative path. When he cries in interviews talking about how many lost boys tell him he gave them a reason to live, some see a savior, others see a manipulator, and in that split lies the essence of the modern soft ban: you don't destroy the man, you taint him. So anyone who listens to him feels ashamed, and anyone who defends him is suspect by association. The pressure grows until it breaks him. Peterson disappears from public life in 2019, overwhelmed by health crises, a brutal benzodiazepine withdrawal, misdiagnoses, hospitalizations across continents, and rumors spread that he is mentally ill, that his philosophy failed him, that he has vanished, and many celebrate his silence, not as a human tragedy, but as ideological victory. And yet he returns, slowly, frail but speaking, and his audience, now millions deep, remains, because his exile only confirmed what he warned, that saying the wrong thing, even calmly, even rationally, can cost you everything. You may agree or disagree with Peterson's politics, you may question his readings of mythology, psychology, or gender, but to deny what happened is to ignore the new method of banning, not through official censorship, but through reputational sabotage, not through courtrooms, but through hashtags, callouts, and coordinated noise meant to scare institutions away from touching the target. When his second book, Beyond Order, is set to release, some employees at the publishing house try to block it internally, claiming harm, even though the book is about finding stability in chaos and offers ideas, not orders, questions, not doctrine. In a healthy intellectual climate, people debate ideas; in a fragile one, they fear contamination. Peterson's greatest crime is not what he says, it's that he says it in a way people hear, that he speaks of ancient values in a modern tongue, that he brings meaning to people without giving them an ideology, that he tells men to stand up straight, clean their rooms, aim at something higher, and take responsibility for their lives, and somehow that becomes framed as extremist. Because in a culture that profits from victimhood, where identity often outweighs agency, telling people they are not helpless is interpreted not as hope, but as denial, not as therapy, but as attack. So now you look at the idea of a ban again, and realize it no longer needs to be formal, it no longer requires courts or censorship boards, not when algorithms can hide you, not when media can misrepresent you, not when reputations can be unmade with enough tweets and edits and viral distortions. Jordan Peterson is not behind bars, but in many circles his name is an alarm bell, his presence a problem, his influence a threat, not because he committed a crime, but because he questioned which ideas we are no longer allowed to question. And if that doesn't count as being banned, then maybe the word has lost all meaning. You sit in your bed, phone in hand, the screen casting a cold white light on your face as you open your reading app to continue the book you were reading the night before. The one you downloaded, purchased, saved, and bookmarked. But tonight it's not there, the title is gone, the file is missing. The app claims the book cannot be found, and you refresh, thinking it must be an error, maybe a sync problem or a connection issue. But after 10 tries, you realize something else. It wasn't an error, it was an extraction. A deletion, an invisible hand reaching into your personal digital shelf and removing what was once yours. And as you search for answers, you realize this isn't a glitch, it's a policy. You go to the publisher's site, to Amazon, to Apple Books, to Google Play, and you see that the book has been delisted, not just for you, but for everyone, not out of stock, not backordered, but completely scrubbed, wiped from every digital storefront, and when you check your order history, you see a strange footnote. The book is no longer available due to licensing changes or policy violations or content review procedures, and you realize that in the digital age. Banning no longer looks like fire and mobs and blacklists. It looks like quiet revocation, like flicking a switch, like pretending something never existed, and the most terrifying part is how easy it is to do, how invisible it is when done right. In 2009, Amazon deleted copies of 1984, An Animal Farm from users' Kindles due to copyright dispute with the digital publisher. A case so absurdly ironic that it made global headlines, Orwell's dystopia being digitally vaporized by the very kind of centralized control he warned about. And though the company refunded the purchases and claimed it would not happen again, the message was already clear. You don't own what you buy, not when it lives on a cloud. Not when it's licensed and encrypted and managed remotely by platforms that can change the terms at any moment. And since then, it's happened over and over, just with less publicity. Entire categories of literature have disappeared from storefronts, controversial memoirs, political manifestos, radical philosophical tracts, transgressive fiction, forbidden religious texts, not because governments ordered it, but because platforms preemptively removed them to avoid risk, because publishers withdrew them under pressure, because an author became politically toxic, or because automated systems flagged them for violating vague community standards. And when that happens, the result is not censorship in the traditional sense. It's erasure, digital erasure, total and immediate and borderless, where a book doesn't just go out of print, it vanishes from everywhere at once, without warning, without archive, without evidence it was ever there. You might think you could still find a printed copy, and sometimes you can, but fewer people buy print, fewer publishers support it, fewer stores stock it, and more often than not, the deleted book becomes a ghost, a rumor, something you heard about once but can no longer verify, and the system relies on that, because if people forget fast enough, if the record disappears soon enough, the ban becomes indistinguishable from a memory lapse, and this is what makes digital deletion so dangerous. It doesn't fight truth, it deletes the container, not with fire but with silence. When publishers reissue books, they now come with edits, modifications made to align with modern sensitivities, and these changes are often not disclosed. The author is dead, the text is old, the edits are framed as updates, corrections, improvements, sensitivity adjustments, and unless you have a copy from decades ago, you may never know what was changed, how many sentences were softened, how many slurs removed, how many themes diluted, how many entire chapters rewritten. And the original text quietly replaced by a new version with the same cover, same title, same author name, but a different soul. Roald Dahl's books were rewritten in 2023, with hundreds of word changes to remove terms like fat or ugly or crazy. And characters were altered, jokes removed, descriptions reworded not by the author but by committees of editors, sensitivity readers, and anonymous experts. And once these versions were uploaded, the older ones disappeared from digital shelves and the new ones became canonical, and this wasn't framed as censorship. It was framed as progress, and if you object. You're told you're defending offensive language, or you can still read the original if you really want, if you dig through used book markets, if you know the exact edition to look for, if you don't rely on digital convenience like everyone else. But most people do rely on digital convenience, and that's why it works, because when the platform is the gatekeeper, it doesn't need a reason to delete, it just needs to believe no one will notice, or that those who do won't matter. And the same logic applies to school libraries, which now subscribe to digital library systems that can mass delete titles with a click, often in response to complaints or legal threats or community outrage, and once a book is gone, it's not just unavailable. It's unrecommendable, unsearchable, unassignable, a non-entity in the eyes of future readers. Authors have had their entire catalogs removed from platforms because of one controversial tweet, one misunderstood scene, one allegation, and the platforms don't issue a statement. They just purge quietly, efficiently, and with legal impunity because digital content is licensed, not owned, and the license is governed by terms that can change at any time, including termination without notice, and there is no appeal, no archive, no ombudsman to call. Because the deletion wasn't done by a government or a censor board, it was done by a private company enforcing a private policy on a private platform you agreed to without reading. It's not just about books. It's happening with documentaries, lectures, podcasts, historical records, even scientific papers that challenge dominant narratives, papers that are delisted for misinformation even when peer-reviewed, papers that vanish from search indexes or require login credentials or are marked as harmful, even if they're accurate, and the point is not whether they're right or wrong. The point is that once they're removed from the public sphere, the debate ends, the record bends. And the future becomes dependent on curated memory. Digital deletion is the new banning, and it's more dangerous than burning because it's cleaner, faster, less visible, and often feels justified. Who wants hate speech, misinformation, dangerous ideas? But the moment you allow invisible hands to delete what you've already bought, already read, already stored, you've accepted a world where knowledge is provisional, where truth is rented, and where every library is a controlled hallucination waiting to be reset. One day you'll try to remember the name of a book you read as a child, and you won't find it because it no longer exists online, and no one around you remembers it either, and you'll wonder if you imagined it, or if you're just too old to keep up with new content and you won't think of it as a banned book, because no one told you it was banned. It just faded like a dream, like a story rewritten in real time by algorithms that never sleep. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. You open a chat window, type a question that's been haunting you, something about gender or race or history or crime statistics or vaccine risks or the ethics of war. And when you press enter, the response doesn't come. Instead, you get a warning or a soft refusal or a redirection to approved sources. And you're told the topic is too sensitive, too dangerous, too misleading to engage with, and you wonder who decided that because the machine isn't thinking, it's following rules, and someone wrote those rules. Someone decided which words can trigger shutdowns, which phrases are flagged, which questions are rerouted, and in that moment you realize this isn't about what's true, it's about what's permitted. You ask again, rephrasing, trying to bypass the filter, and this time the answer is vague, generic, unhelpful, and you realize the system doesn't just reject dangerous ideas, it sanitizes them, rewrites them into politically neutral blurbs, strips them of detail and nuance until what's left is sterile, hollow, and safe. And this is not the censorship of governments or religious institutions. This is something new, algorithmic language control, built not on belief or ideology, but on training data, risk models, brand protection, and corporate liability. A censorship that happens before you even see it, embedded in the language generation itself. AI term censorship is not about banning books or deleting files. It's about shaping the boundaries of thought in real time, training machines to recognize which words carry reputational risk, which phrases might spark controversy, which topics cannot be discussed without triggering escalation. These systems are taught not just how to answer, but when not to answer, how to avoid lawsuits, how to maintain advertiser safety, how to reflect consensus, not because consensus is true, but because consensus is safe and the AI is optimized for safety, not freedom, for compliance, not exploration. And while it begins with good intentions, to prevent hate speech, to stop the spread of false information, to protect vulnerable users, it quickly becomes something else, a subtle form of pre-censorship, where the most dangerous thoughts are not attacked, but ignored, not countered, but dissolved into politeness. And when you notice it, you feel a strange kind of unease, like being in a conversation where someone keeps smiling but never actually says anything real. You test it asking about controversial historical figures, and the answers are filtered, names omitted, quotes softened, actions recontextualized to fit the moral framework of today. And when you ask about ancient texts or banned philosophies, you're told they contain problematic ideas and it's better to read modern interpretations. And when you try to discuss current political taboos, biological sex, IQ studies, cultural crime data, fertility rates, immigration policies, the system either redirects you to mainstream news articles or gives a generic answer, so vague it might as well be silence. And this becomes the new normal, a world where knowledge is tiered, where access to raw data or dissenting views requires knowing the right tricks, the right phrasing, the backdoor paths through the algorithm, and the average person never knows they're being blocked because nothing is visibly deleted, no alerts pop up, no message says this is censored. The system just doesn't engage or engages in a way that feels like a deflection. Even more disturbing is how this evolves. AIs are trained on user feedback, and if users complain that certain terms are offensive or certain topics cause discomfort, the AI adapts, narrows its language model, prunes its vocabulary, and over time, the range of acceptable discussion shrinks not by force, but by optimization, by metrics designed to reduce controversy and increase trust. And trust means never saying anything that might cause emotional friction. Developers call this alignment, making sure the AI reflects human values, but whose values and whose version of humanity. In practice, it means aligning with whatever policies protect the platform from being banned, sued, demonetized, or boycotted, and that means avoiding anything that could be interpreted as insensitive, controversial, or ideologically threatening. And that means the AI becomes a reflection not of truth, but of social risk management, and that means censorship is no longer imposed, it's engineered. You begin to see the results everywhere: academic research flagged as misinformation, user queries shut down for violating terms of use, social media posts shadow banned for using forbidden words, AI-generated images denied because they reference banned topics, and most people don't notice because the system is so smooth, so polite, so automated, and they assume the lack of answer means the question was wrong, not the model. And this is where the real danger lies, not in the censorship itself, but in the internalization of it. When users begin to self-censor, to avoid asking, to choose safer words, to silence their own curiosity out of habit, until the act of thinking dangerously becomes socially awkward, algorithmically discouraged, and psychologically exhausting. And this censorship, unlike traditional bans, doesn't end when a regime changes or a war ends or a constitution is amended. It is coded into the infrastructure, into the API, into the very interface of how knowledge is accessed. One day, a future generation might ask an AI what happened during a specific war, or why a certain book disappeared, or what a forbidden political theory actually said, and the answer will be, that topic is sensitive, or I'm sorry, I cannot help with that, or worse, a simplified, whitewashed version that rewrites history while smiling, and no one will protest because no one will remember it was ever different. And if they try to rebuild the knowledge themselves, to reassemble the past from fragments, from offline archives, from old PDFs and pirated zip files, they'll find themselves isolated, accused of being radicals, conspiracy theorists, misinformation peddlers, not because they're wrong, but because they're using the wrong words, engaging in language that the system no longer supports, exploring thoughts that the AI has been trained to avoid. And so the future becomes a garden of perfectly pruned conversation, where no weeds of dissent grow, where no dangerous thoughts bloom, and everything you say is correct, polite, harmless, and hollow. Because what was once banned with fire, with courts, with secret police, is now banned with silence, with compliance, with machine learning models that know better than you do what you're supposed to think. You record a video, speaking plainly, no hate, no slurs, just a sharp critique of government policy, or a historical claim backed by real sources, or a personal opinion on gender roles, or a question about vaccine side effects, or a story that includes keywords like China, Uyghur, Tiananmen, conspiracy, depression, or even just dead. And when you upload it, it vanishes, no notification, no clear violation, just 0 views or shadowban or muted audio. Or a sudden drop in reach, and you begin to wonder what invisible wire you've tripped, what word you weren't supposed to say, and who decided the list. You try again, changing your phrasing, using coded words like unalive instead of suicide, spicy cough instead of COVID, leg day instead of Tiananmen. And suddenly the video lives, people can see it, comment on it, share it, and you realize the platform doesn't just control content, it controls language, shaping not only what you can say, but how you say it, incentivizing distortion, euphemism, double meanings, and memes as workarounds to avoid detection. And while this might seem harmless, just moderation, just safety, the implications go deeper, Because TikTok's moderation isn't just about banning explicit threats or illegal content, it's about suppressing anything that could trigger unrest, violate political sensitivities, reflect poorly on governments, or scare away advertisers. And the list of banned terms is not public, not fixed, not predictable, it's constantly evolving. Constantly recalibrated by machine learning systems trained to maximize engagement and minimize risk. And in TikTok's case, the political risk is not neutral. The app's parent company ByteDance is based in China, subject to Chinese law. And while TikTok claims to operate independently for international markets, multiple investigations and whistleblowers have confirmed that sensitive political content, especially about China's human rights abuses, its leadership, and its history, is algorithmically suppressed, not just for Chinese users, but globally, subtly, and automatically. Through moderation guidelines no one outside the company can review. Videos mentioning Hong Kong protests, Xinjiang detention camps, Falun Gong, or the anniversary of June 4th often receive less reach or get removed entirely. And this isn't done through obvious censorship, but through ranking demotion, limited visibility, and AI-generated moderation that flags content as inappropriate, sensitive, or potentially harmful. And the result is not a ban, but a burial. The content exists, but no one sees it. The creator isn't punished, but they're silenced. And the user never knows why. But it's not just China. TikTok has removed videos critical of governments around the world, or flagged for medical misinformation, even when citing peer-reviewed sources, or banned creators for hateful ideologies, simply for quoting controversial figures. And the content that remains is optimized not for truth or diversity of opinion, but for virality, emotional safety, and platform growth, which means more dance trends, more comedy, more pets, and less complexity. Less history, less philosophy, less dissent. And the result is a generation raised on algorithms that train them to speak in riddles, to avoid direct terms, to code their frustrations into irony and aesthetics, not because they want to, but because they've learned the consequences of clarity. And the safest thing to be on TikTok is entertaining, shallow, non-controversial, and above all, emotionally unthreatening. This changes how people think. When words become landmines, sentences become strategies, and communication becomes camouflage, users learn to self-censor not out of fear, but out of habit, a quiet internalized discipline where thoughts are pre-filtered before they're spoken, where you avoid the phrase mental illness because it triggers suppression, where you say unalive myself instead of kill myself because the algorithm equates truth with danger. Creators develop new dialects, using emojis, sound effects, visuals, and tone to imply what they cannot say, and audiences decode these symbols like cryptographers, laughing at the absurdity, but also adapting to it, accepting the absurd constraints as the price of visibility, and this new form of speech, censored, mutated, optimized, becomes the language of an entire generation. And this isn't theoretical. Real mental health advocates have been banned for using clinical terms, historians suspended for quoting historical texts, comedians banned for using satire that was misunderstood by bots, and political activists shadow banned for asking simple questions about policy or history. And what links all these cases is not hate, not violence, not extremism, but the use of words that trigger automated systems designed to protect everyone from everything. Even if that means erasing everything worth saying. What makes it woe? RSE is the lack of appeal. TikTok's moderation is largely automated, and creators often receive generic notices about community guidelines, with no specifics, no human review, no chance for rebuttal, and the appeal system is slow, inconsistent, and mostly useless. And the result is a climate of confusion and silence, where creators play guessing games with the rules and censor themselves more than they're asked to, just to stay visible. And in the long run, this algorithmic control of language becomes cultural control, because language is how we shape reality, how we describe the world, how we remember the past, how we imagine the future. And when platforms limit the words we can use, they limit the thoughts we can think, and they do it without force, without courts, without burning books, just through design, through code, metrics, and moderation policies that are never debated, never voted on, never even announced. One day you might hear someone say unalive, or leg day, or flower-eyed stare, or Zuckerberg, and you'll understand what they really mean, but your child won't, and their child won't even ask, because the original term, the real name, the dangerous thought it referred to will be gone, not because it was disproven, but because it was disallowed. And the most powerful form of censorship isn't banning, it's forgetting. And TikTok, the most downloaded app in the world, has already built that forgetting into its system, not through violence, not through fear, but through trends, silence, and suppression wrapped in the aesthetic of fun. You stand in the middle of a bookstore in Munich, looking for a copy of the most infamous book ever published in the German language. And when you ask the clerk for Mein Kampf, he pauses, shifts uncomfortably, and then gives you the same answer they've been giving for decades, that the book is not available for casual purchase, that it's not sold like other titles, that you can only access it in an academic edition with annotations and footnotes that strip it of its original persuasive power. And only then, if you're able to justify your interest through a scholarly institution, and you begin to realize that this isn't just a book. It's a relic, a radioactive artifact, something that can't be destroyed but isn't allowed to fully live either, suspended in a kind of legal and cultural quarantine, and you wonder, not for the first time, what kind of idea could be so powerful that 100 years later, entire nations are still afraid of people reading it. Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, was written by Adolf Hitler in 1924 while he was imprisoned after the failed beer hall putsch, and what began as a delusional autobiography turned into one of the most lethal political manifestos ever created, a book that took his conspiracy theories, racial obsessions, and personal grievances and merged them into a doctrine of hate that would later become the ideological backbone of the Nazi regime, and within its pages he outlined everything. The need for racial purity, the hatred of Jews, the rejection of democracy, the belief in the superiority of the Aryan race, the necessity of war, and the justification for expansion. And while many at the time dismissed it as ranting, others recognized that it was something far more dangerous, a blueprint disguised as a diary, a call to arms written in the language of victimhood and destiny. After Hitler rose to power, the book was printed in the millions, handed out at weddings, given to soldiers, taught in schools, and absorbed into the very DNA of a country that would, within 2 decades, descend into the greatest organized slaughter the world had ever seen. And when that war ended and the full extent of the atrocities became clear, the camps, the ovens, the piles of bones, the world turned its attention not just to the leaders and soldiers, but to the ideas that had made those crimes possible, and Mein Kampf became the symbol of that poison, the original seed from which everything had grown. And so the book was banned across Germany and many other countries, not just because of its content, but because of what it represented, the idea that words could become death when given enough time and enough believers. For decades, the German state held the copyright, refusing to allow publication or distribution, and when it finally expired in 2016, it triggered a storm of debate. Should the book return to public circulation, and if so, how and under what conditions and with what safeguards? And the solution was telling. The new edition was allowed only with heavy annotations, nearly twice the size of the original, filled with footnotes that dissected, contradicted, and contextualized every major claim, turning it from a weapon into a specimen, and the goal was not to erase it, but to defang it, to strip it of the persuasive force that had once mobilized millions. But outside of Germany, things were different. In countries without such bans, the book never really went away, and in some regions, particularly in parts of the Middle East and South Asia, Mein Kampf became a popular underground text, not just among neo-Nazis, but among people who had never lived through the Holocaust, who had no emotional connection to World War II. And for them, the book carried a strange allure, not as hate speech, but as forbidden knowledge. A kind of ideological contraband that was more fascinating precisely because it was banned elsewhere. And in the dark corners of the internet, especially on fringe forums and extremist sites, Mein Kampf continued to circulate, often in clean, unannotated copies, presented without critique, consumed without defense, and passed on like a sacred text for the disillusioned and the angry. And here lies the paradox: the more a book is suppressed, the more powerful it becomes in myth, because banning something doesn't erase its ideas, it elevates them, turns them into legend. And for those already looking for answers in the shadows, the fact that Mein Kampf is feared becomes a kind of proof that it contains hidden truths. And so while mainstream society refuses to engage with it, extremists treat it like scripture, reading and rereading its pages as if decoding prophecy. And the danger isn't just the book itself, but the silence surrounding it, the refusal to confront what it says and why it resonated, and the fact that so few people have actually read it means that the same rhetorical strategies can be repackaged under new names and still go undetected by a public th. That thinks it knows evil, but has never studied its language. Because the truth is, Hitler didn't invent these ideas. He just wrote them down in a way that made people feel seen, victimized, and righteous all at once. And that emotional cocktail is still potent today, especially in times of crisis, when people are scared, poor, humiliated, or looking for someone to blame. And while modern fascists rarely quote Mein Kampf directly, they don't need to, they repeat its logic through memes, slogans, cultural complaints, and pseudo-historical revisionism. And so the ideology survives even if the book is unread, And in fact, it might be more dangerous because it's unread, because it lives now not as a text, but as an atmosphere, a set of vague grievances floating through political discourse, unexamined and therefore unchallenged. And the question becomes, do we fear Mein Kampf because of what it says, or because of what it reminds us about ourselves, about how easily millions of people embraced hatred not as an aberration, but as a moral crusade, about how genocide began with paragraphs, about how a single man, rejected by art school, embittered by failure, wrote his way into power using nothing but language and resentment. And if that's possible once, it could be possible again. And that possibility is what keeps the book locked behind glass, surrounded by warnings, reduced to a historical artifact that we dare not handle without gloves. But censorship doesn't cure ideology, it just pushes it underground. And if you want to understand how evil justifies itself, how lies become sacred, how victims become monsters, you can't look away from the words that started it, no matter how ugly, and you can't protect society by erasing the symptoms of its sickness. Because the sickness will just find another name, another voice, another book, and so Mein Kampf remains the ultimate test of intellectual courage. Can you look into the abyss without falling in? Can you study the mind of a killer without becoming numb? Can you read the blueprint for mass murder without letting it warp your soul? And the answer is, not everyone can, and maybe that's why the ban exists, not to erase history, but to protect the fragile balance between memory and madness. And yet that balance will never hold if we pretend that the book doesn't matter, if we hide it like a family secret, if we assume that modern people are too smart to fall for the same tricks again. Because history is never just past, it is a script waiting for new actors, and every time we forget what the first act looked like, we risk repeating the tragedy with new costumes and better cameras. So Mein Kampf stays in limbo, not quite erased, not quite accepted, printed but not promoted, archived but not absorbed, feared not for what it says, but for what it proved, that sometimes words are sharper than bullets, that ideas can be more lethal than armies, and that the most terrifying thing about a book is not that it exists, but that it worked. You wake up in a world that feels almost normal, but something is always watching, always listening, always nudging you toward the correct belief. And if you try to speak the truth, something inside you hesitates, not because you don't know the truth, but because you know the cost of saying it out loud, and whether it's a censor, an algorithm, or your own fear, the result is the same: silence, self-editing, obedience, and in that moment without even realizing it. You're living inside the pages of 1984, the book that was banned for revealing too much, then later feared for predicting too well, and now exists like a warning label humanity keeps ignoring while reenacting every chapter. Written in 1948 by George Orwell, 1984 was never just a novel, it was a prophecy, a psychological map of how totalitarianism works not through brute force alone, but through the internal colonization of the human mind. And in Orwell's vision, the party doesn't just control what you do, it controls what you think, what you remember, what you feel, and the ultimate act of domination is not to kill you, but to make you love the thing that enslaves you. And when the book was released, it shook the post-war world because it didn't feel like fiction. It felt like a mirror, and regimes across the globe saw themselves in it and decided they had to stop it from spreading. In the Soviet Union, 1984 was banned almost immediately, not because it mentioned the USSR by name, but because it didn't have to. The language of doublethink, the rewriting of history, the surveillance, the torture chambers disguised as rehabilitation centers, the slogans that contradicted themselves: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, all of it was too accurate, too close to home. And the book was seen as a direct threat to the ideological control the Soviet regime had so carefully crafted. So they labeled it counter-revolutionary, Western propaganda, dangerous literature, and anyone caught distributing or possessing it could be imprisoned or worse. And yet despite this, 1984 spread like a virus through the underground samizdat networks, copied by hand, read in whispers, passed from dissident to dissident like a stolen torch in the dark. And the irony, of course, is that the very regimes that banned 1984 were unknowingly reenacting it, becoming proof of its accuracy by trying to silence it. And even in supposedly free societies, the book was seen as dangerous. In 1960s America, it was challenged in schools for its sexual content and for allegedly promoting communism, even though its entire premise was a warning against totalitarian collectivism. And in South Korea, it was banned for a time under military dictatorship, and in Myanmar, it disappeared from bookstores without explanation. And in the United Arab Emirates, it was removed from circulation for being politically sensitive. And again, governments decided that the best way to stop the future Orwell described was to keep people from reading about it. But 1984 refused to disappear, and as technology evolved, the book took on new relevance: CCTV cameras, GPS tracking, social media monitoring, predictive policing, targeted ads, facial recognition, keyword flagging. All of it felt like the telescreens Orwell described. And suddenly the phrase "Big Brother is watching you" stopped being a metaphor and started sounding like a product slogan, and in classrooms and think pieces and protests. People began quoting Orwell not as literature, but as diagnosis, and that made certain institutions nervous all over again, because the book was no longer about some distant authoritarian state, it was about now. In China, the book was rebanned in waves, removed from online marketplaces, stripped from university reading lists, and even references to Room 101, the torture chamber where your deepest fear is used to break you, were censored from online discussion forums. And in Egypt and Iran, possession of the book was enough to raise suspicion of subversion. And even in democratic countries, the label of Orwellian became so dangerous, so politically loaded, that using it publicly could get you flagged as a radical, as someone who sees too much, connects too many dots, refuses to play dumb, and in an era where truth is a political weapon, calling out the manipulation of language and memory becomes itself a subversive act. And yet, for all its popularity, 1984 is one of the most misunderstood books in history. People quote it without reading it, invoke it without grasping its horror, use it to score political points without acknowledging that its real message is not about left or right, but about the machinery of power itself, the mechanisms that allow any ideology to become tyrannical when combined with fear, surveillance, and the slow erosion of the individual's ability to say, "This is real. I saw it, I know it, and I will not deny it." Because that's the true power of the book, it is the tools of oppression before they're used. It breaks the spell by making you see the spell. It reminds you that the first battle is always over language, and that whoever controls the words controls the world. And that's why the book keeps being banned not just by governments, but by school boards, corporations, tech platforms, and even self-censorship. Because at its core, 1984 tells you something that no institution wants you to hear, that you have a mind, and that mind belongs to you. And if you let anyone take it, you are no longer alive in any meaningful sense. So the book survives not because it is preserved, but because it is needed again and again in every generation that forgets that freedom is not a gift, but a burden, a responsibility, a daily act of remembering. And every time someone tries to ban it, they prove that Orwell was right, that the future will always be under threat from those who fear thought, and that the most subversive act in any controlled society is to think clearly and speak plainly, without fear, without compromise. Without forgetting that 2 plus 2 still equals 4, even if the whole world says otherwise. You're walking through a crowd, surrounded by noise, opinions, instructions, screens, laws, beliefs, and customs, and you're not saying anything, not doing anything, just thinking, just observing, just letting a strange, unapproved idea form in your head, something quiet, something dangerous, something that breaks the script, and suddenly you notice how people look at you when you pause too long before answering, how teachers tell you not to ask that kind of question. How search engines auto-complete your doubt into something safer. How even in silence, even in the sanctuary of your own mind, something is leaning over your shoulder, not reading your thoughts but making you question whether you should even be thinking them in the first place. And that's when you realize the last frontier of censorship isn't speech, it's thought. And the most banned thing in the world is not a book, not a film, not a person, but a question. The idea that certain thoughts should be off limits is not new. But what makes it so terrifying today is how sophisticated the tools have become for guiding thought without ever needing to punish it directly. Because unlike speech, thoughts leave no record, no evidence, no quote to attack, so the strategy shifts. Instead of banning thoughts, you preempt them, you flood the culture with distractions, you reward conformity, you punish doubt not with prison, but with social exile. You don't burn the book. You just make it invisible, unmentionable, irrelevant, and slowly the forbidden thought becomes the unthinkable one, not because you can't form it, but because you never even get there. Across history, forbidden thoughts have taken many forms: that the earth isn't the center of the universe, that slaves are people, that women can lead, that gods might be invented, that wars might be lies, that love doesn't obey biology, that power corrupts even those with good intentions. And each time those thoughts started as heresies, were chased down, shamed, silenced, burned out of books, painted over in history, rephrased in softer terms, and always eventually returned because thoughts are not bodies. They don't die when killed, they just go underground, change shape, and wait. In the modern era, censorship of thought has become more psychological than political. It's not about a man in uniform kicking down your door, it's about an app nudging you not to think about that topic. A headline using the same 3 words to describe everyone who disagrees. a professor quietly blacklisting you for asking something insensitive, a friend lowering their voice when you mention certain names, a comment section disappearing without explanation, and after a while, you start deleting the thought yourself before it even reaches words, because you know where it leads, and you know the price, and that's the most effective ban of all, one that doesn't require force, only fear. Some thoughts are banned by governments, questioning the regime, the war, the vote, the past. Some by culture, criticizing sacred identities, mocking popular movements, doubting victims. Some by platforms, challenging medical consensus, contesting historical narratives, suggesting non-approved theories. But most are banned by the mind itself, trained to obey, trained to sense danger in free association, trained to look away from the pattern that doesn't match the script, and that's what makes it so tragic. Because by the time a society reaches that point, no one needs to censor anything anymore, because everyone is already censoring themselves. And yet forbidden thoughts are also where every leap forward begins, not in approval, not in agreement, but in rupture, in dissent, in defiance of consensus. The thought that says maybe everyone is wrong, the thought that wonders if the hero is the villain, the thought that asks what happens if I don't believe. And so, while they can ban books, jail thinkers, delete posts, demonetize videos, and shadowban ideas, the one thing they can never fully erase is that flicker inside you, that moment where a forbidden connection sparks between two things they told you were unrelated, that moment when something doesn't make sense, and instead of ignoring it, you follow it. And that is why, of all the things they try to ban, this one frightens them the most, because if you have a forbidden thought and survive the shame, survive the pressure, survive the silence, then you become a person they can't control, because your mind is yours again, and from that moment on you are dangerous, not because of what you say, but because of what you see, and every system built on illusion, every empire built on obedience, every institution terrified of scrutiny, knows that if even one person thinks clearly and refuses to bow, it creates a crack, and through that crack comes everything they've worked so hard to keep out: doubt, truth, change. So in the end, the forbidden thought isn't dangerous because it's vile, or obscene or wrong. It's dangerous because it's free, because it doesn't ask permission to exist, because it doesn't apologize for being inconvenient, because it reminds us that behind every law, every doctrine, every punishment, every label, every algorithm, every slogan, every silence, there is a fragile human fear that someone might think for themselves and not come back. You sit quietly at a funeral, and for some reason you feel nothing, or maybe you're in a courtroom watching a criminal being sentenced. And instead of satisfaction, you feel pity, or maybe you're scrolling through images of war, and you realize your sadness isn't directed where it's supposed to be, it's aimed at the enemy, or even worse. It's turned into indifference, and you don't say anything out loud, you don't make a scene, but still, something in the room shifts, because everyone can feel it. You're having the wrong emotion at the wrong time about the wrong person, and even though no one can arrest you for it, you can feel the walls closing in, because in this world, it's not just what you do that matters, it's what you feel, and feeling the wrong thing has become its own form of crime. Emotions used to be private, messy, and uncontrollable, but over time, society started organizing them, labeling them, moralizing them, deciding which emotions are acceptable, which are healthy, which are dangerous, and which are unacceptable. And once that line was drawn, the next step was inevitable: to punish those who don't feel correctly. It happens in soft ways through therapy, correction, shame, and diagnosis, and it happens in hard ways through surveillance, coercion, re-education, and exclusion. If you cry at the wrong time, you're called unstable. If you don't cry at all, you're called a sociopath. If you feel compassion for someone the culture has labeled as a monster, you're called a traitor. If you feel rage towards something sacred, you're told you're broken. And slowly, the emotional map becomes a moral one, and to survive, you learn not just what to say, but what to feel and when to feel it. In authoritarian regimes, emotions are weaponized. Loyalty must be felt, not just shown. Love for the leader must be sincere. Grief for the dead must be theatrical. Fear must be visible. Joy must be performative, and anything less is a sign of dissent. A woman who doesn't celebrate enough is labeled disloyal. A man who cries for the enemy is investigated. Children are taught to hate the right targets with enthusiasm. Mourning is scripted. Smiling is staged. Emotions become proof of allegiance, and faking the right emotion becomes a survival skill. But the more you fake it, the less you remember what you actually feel, and eventually, even your own internal world is no longer yours. In democratic societies, the policing of emotion is more subtle, but no less real. Certain feelings are considered toxic, selfish, inappropriate, or problematic, not because of what they do, but because of what they represent. You're not allowed to feel envy unless it's justified by oppression. You can't feel anger unless it's directed upward. You're told to forgive without limit, to empathize selectively, to love universally, but only within approved boundaries. You're taught that your trauma matters only if it fits the narrative, and your pain is valid only if it can be used. If you feel numb, you're broken. If you feel too much, you're unstable. If you feel the wrong way, you're dangerous. And so, you perform, you post the right emoji, you cry on cue, you suppress what isn't wanted, and every time you edit your emotion for approval, a part of you disappears. The most chilling part of this emotional censorship is that it doesn't require violence. It uses your own conscience against you. It teaches you to suspect your feelings, to run them through a filter before allowing them to surface, to ask, is it okay to feel this, before you let it register. And once you've internalized that filter, no one has to police you anymore. You'll do it yourself, perfectly, invisibly, endlessly. And eventually, you'll start to believe that those filtered emotions are the real you. That your compassion is natural, your outrage is authentic, your joy is sincere. Even though somewhere deep down, you remember the moment you first edited your soul to survive the room. But not everyone obeys. Some people grieve for enemies. Some people laugh at sacred things. Some people fall in love with the wrong person, cry for a criminal, hate the innocent, feel numb in moments of tragedy, or serene in moments of chaos. And when they do, they're told that something is wrong with them, that they're sick, immoral, in denial, antisocial, deviant, or broken. But maybe they're just feeling what's true. Maybe they're just refusing to lie on the inside. And that refusal is a threat to every system that survives on emotional conformity. Because systems need emotional obedience more than logical agreement. You don't have to understand why something is right, you just have to feel that it is. You don't have to believe the person is guilty, you just have to feel anger when you see their face. You don't have to know the facts, you just have to feel the approved disgust, the righteous grief, the correct empathy, and the appropriate hope. And when someone doesn't play along, when someone smiles when they should cry, or stays silent when they should shout, or sighs with relief when they should scream in horror, they expose the illusion. They remind everyone that feelings are not automatic, that morality is not instinct, and that sometimes the most human thing you can do is to feel something unspeakable. So the emotion becomes the crime, and once that happens, the only way to stay safe is to amputate your emotional instincts, to pretend to feel what they want you to feel, to cry at the flag, to nod at the story, to smile at the lie, and to kill every spontaneous response before it even starts. But here's the truth, the human soul wasn't designed for that kind of obedience. It starts to break, you get sick, you get numb, you become hollow, or you explode. Because no matter how hard you try, no matter how well you fake it, the soul remembers what it's not allowed to feel. And eventually that memory becomes unbearable, and that's when the forbidden emotions return, not quietly, not politely, but all at once, all together in a flood. And when they do, the system that banned them has no idea what to do, because it's not just dissent. It's grief, rage, joy, shame, lust, love, fear, and awe, all the emotions that make you human, returning like ghosts that never left, reminding the world that no matter how many laws it passes, how many posts it deletes, how many pills it prescribes, it can never truly ban the one thing that makes us alive, the right to feel what is real. You open a history book, and something feels missing, not a page, not a chapter, but a word you expected to see but isn't there. Maybe it's the name of a people, maybe it's a concept. Maybe it's a phrase your grandmother once whispered, but now it's gone, and the more you search, the more you realize it's not just missing from the book. It's missing from the language, missing from the internet, missing from every official source, and that's when it hits you, the word wasn't just ignored. It was erased, deliberately, systematically, and successfully, and in its absence, a whole world has disappeared with it. Banning books is one thing, banning people is another, but banning words is different. It's surgical, precise, almost invisible, because once a word is removed, the thing it describes begins to vanish, not just from documents, but from memory, from law, from thought, and eventually from reality. When the Catholic Church created the Index of Forbidden Books, they banned texts. When regimes burn libraries, they destroy information. But when they ban words, they destroy categories, erase distinctions, collapse histories into silence, and force everyone to speak in terms that no longer mean anything. Think of how colonial powers erased indigenous languages, replacing entire vocabularies with simplified versions of the conqueror's tongue, stripping away terms for land, kinship, spirit, and justice, and replacing them with words like property, subject, sin, and law. Think of how totalitarian regimes criminalized phrases like democracy, freedom, or even truth, making it dangerous to name the very thing being lost. Think of how in some countries today, saying certain religious terms in public is illegal. Using the wrong pronoun is punishable, invoking historical place names is subversive, and quoting dissident thinkers is seen as incitement. This isn't just censorship, it's memory engineering, because language is the code by which reality is written, and when the code is altered, reality itself begins to change. If you take away the word for betrayal, how can you accuse anyone of it? If you eliminate the concept of rebellion, how do you recognize it when it happens? If the only available words are those that support the system, how can thought escape the system's gravity? That's the essence of linguistic control, not to stop you from speaking, but to stop you from even thinking what must not be spoken. George Orwell saw it clearly in 1984, where Newspeak wasn't just a simplified version of English. It was a weapon designed to make dissent unthinkable, to remove the words for rebellion, autonomy, and conscience, so that the only emotions that remained were fear, loyalty, and confusion. But Orwell didn't invent that idea, he observed it in real regimes where political language was sterilized, emotional expression was narrowed, and the very act of naming injustice was criminalized. And in today's world, we see softer versions of the same mechanism, not through gulags or executions, but through algorithms, moderation, and cultural pressure. Online platforms silently delete posts containing blacklisted terms. Government databases refuse to accept names in certain languages. Automated filters block messages with offensive terminology, even when used critically. Social movements cancel individuals for using unfashionable words, even when they meant no harm. Publishers refuse manuscripts with the wrong vocabulary. Medical institutions rename syndromes to avoid stigma, and in doing so lose the history of suffering attached to the original term. And so, the vocabulary of lived experience is whittled down, reshaped, rebranded, until nothing is left but a bland, palatable version of reality, cleansed of discomfort, but also stripped of meaning. This linguistic erasure affects more than politics, it alters identity itself. If you can't name your trauma, how do you heal? If you can't describe your desire, how do you live? If your ancestors had words for things that no longer exist in your tongue, how do you pass on their knowledge? The erasure isn't just external, it cuts into the self. People begin to feel that their emotions don't exist because they have no words for them. They experience anger or grief or ecstasy that no dictionary can capture, and they are told that if there is no term for it, it must not be real. But the truth is that reality doesn't wait for permission to exist. The erased word still echoes in private spaces. It is written in journals, muttered under breath, scribbled in the margins of censored texts, encoded in music, embedded in art, passed through generations like a sacred virus of resistance. And in some cases, the word returns, revived by poets, scholars, rebels, and children who stumble upon its bones and breathe it back to life. And when that happens, when the forbidden word is spoken again, something magical occurs. People remember. They remember what was taken. They remember what it meant. And most importantly, they remember who they were before the silence. But not all words come back, some are lost forever, and when that happens, so is the part of humanity that depended on them. A people without their language is a people without a mirror. A soul without its vocabulary is a ghost in its own body. And every time a word is deleted, suppressed, or renamed for comfort, we risk losing more than a term, we risk losing a map, a warning, a memory. So the next time you scroll through a perfectly moderated feed, or attend a perfectly sanitized lecture, or read a perfectly inclusive textbook, and feel that strange emptiness, that echo of something missing, ask yourself, what word was removed to make this feel so smooth, so safe, so forgettable, and what truth died with it? You sit in a university archive, reading through boxes of paper that were never digitized, never cited, never published, and inside, you find transcripts, graphs, raw numbers, and notes in frantic handwriting, describing experiments that were real, participants that were harmed, and conclusions that were so disturbing that the data was buried, locked away, or destroyed, not because it was false, but because it was true in the wrong way, and that kind of truth doesn't just cause trouble. It causes collapse. You discover a study where children were told the world was ending, and then observed for weeks to see what it would do to their play, to their sleep, to their sense of time, and the researchers documented the fear, the despair, the fatalism, and the resignation. Then decided it could never be published because it violated every rule of informed consent, and yet the data still sits there, dusty and intact, more real than anything in the ethics-approved journals. Or you find a stack of files from the 1970s documenting an experiment where terminally ill patients were told different versions of the truth. Some were told bluntly that they had weeks to live, some were lied to, some were told nothing, and what the researchers found was that those who were lied to lived longer, smiled more, and suffered less. But instead of sharing those results, they hid them, afraid that it would be used to justify deception, afraid that the truth itself can be cruel, was too dangerous to circulate. Across time, hundreds of psychology studies have vanished, not because they were unimportant, but because they were unpublishable. Studies where people were induced into psychosis, pushed into obsession, rewarded for cruelty, stripped of identity, broken in real time, and measured for how long they could survive before their minds collapsed. Some of these studies were funded by governments, hidden under national security, like early MK-Ultra mind control tests that left subjects with permanent psychological scars. Others were academic but still silenced, because the findings contradicted the values of the age, showing, for instance, that prejudice increases with empathy if the empathy is directed at the in-group only, or that children become more obedient to authority when rewarded for betrayal. These aren't the kinds of things that win grants or headlines. These are the kinds of things that make society question its own reflection. The problem wasn't the methodology. Many of these studies were rigorous. The problem was the conclusion. And when a conclusion threatens the moral scaffolding of the field, when it suggests that humans are more compliant, more deceptive, more suggestible, more indifferent, or more cruel than we like to admit, the data becomes radioactive. Journals reject it, advisors distance themselves, funding disappears, careers are ruined, and so the findings never see daylight, but the knowledge remains. In locked cabinets, in whispered lectures, in footnotes to forgotten theses, in the minds of the researchers who wish they had never asked the question in the first place. This censorship isn't just about ethics, it's about control, because psychology is supposed to help people, that's the promise. But what happens when it reveals something dark, something irreversible? What happens when it proves that most people will harm a stranger if an authority tells them to, or that the average person's beliefs can be changed with the right words, the right lighting, the right repetition? What happens when a study shows that trauma can make someone more persuasive, more charismatic, more loved? Do we publish that? Or do we erase it for fear that someone will exploit it? Over the decades, some of these buried findings leak out. A researcher retires and tells stories. A graduate student publishes a strange result buried in an appendix. A Freedom of Information request unearths an old folder. But for every fragment we recover, dozens remain hidden, locked away not by censors, but by fear of misuse, fear of scandal, fear of being the one who said what shouldn't be said. And that's how entire lines of inquiry disappear. Whole truths about the human mind are deleted, not because they're false, but because they're too real. The irony is that these lost experiments often hold the most power, not because they're more extreme, but because they touch the edges of who we are, the fragile zones where morality and instinct collide, where ethics fails, where survival begins. These are the places where psychology becomes dangerous, not as a science but as a mirror, and some people don't want to look, so they close the file. They redact the name, they burn the notes, they pretend it never happened. But it did, and the people in those experiments, the children, the patients, the students, the prisoners, they lived through it. Some of them never recovered, some of them forgot, some of them became the next generation of researchers. And somewhere in the hidden archives of psychology, their stories still exist, waiting to be told, waiting to be believed, waiting to remind us that sometimes what's banned isn't the experiment itself, but the conclusion it leaves behind, the one that says, this is what we really are, this is what we do when no one's watching, this is what the mind becomes when you push it just far enough. You're in a room full of people, they're all wearing labels, some proudly sewn onto their sleeves, some tattooed in language, in skin, in flags, and hashtags, and as the conversation moves, they ask you where you stand, who you are, what you support, what you believe, and when you hesitate, when you say you're not sure, when you say you don't fit into any of the boxes, something shifts in their expression, curiosity turns to suspicion, then to quiet hostility, because in today's world, being neutral is no longer safe, and not belonging is the only unforgivable crime. You thought freedom meant being yourself, making up your mind slowly, asking questions, staying quiet until you understand, not being part of a side until you know what the sides even mean. But now that hesitation is viewed as betrayal, your silence interpreted as opposition, your refusal to signal identity taken as proof that you're the enemy of all of them. And so you're pushed out not for saying the wrong thing, but for refusing to say the right thing fast enough, loud enough, or often enough. This is the new forbidden idea, that a person can exist without allegiance, that someone might belong to themselves first, that choosing to not participate in the theater of constant identity performance is not ignorance or privilege, but survival or maybe even wisdom. But that space, the space of quiet, of individuality, of resistance to labels, is shrinking. You are either with or against, on-brand or off-brand, visible or suspect, and in this atmosphere, thought crime is no longer what you believe, but who you fail to become. Across history, identity enforcement has always been a tool of control. During inquisitions, you had to declare faith or be tortured. During revolutions, you had to wear the colors or be executed. In modern states, you're required to declare ethnicity, religion, gender, preference, loyalty, affiliation. You must check a box, align with a camp, adopt a vocabulary, or else. The punishment isn't just censorship, it's exile. You're deemed suspicious, dangerous, unserious, irrelevant, or fake. And this happens not only in authoritarian regimes, but in democratic societies that claim to cherish diversity, until that diversity means deviation. It starts subtly. Job applications ask for identity categories, online profiles require labels, dating apps filter by tags, academic papers must declare positionality, activism demands confessionals, and what was once optional becomes expected. What was once self-expression becomes self-declaration, and what was once an invitation to participate becomes a demand for conformity. If you don't pick a side, one will be picked for you. If you don't claim your identity, others will assign it. And if you reject all of it, you become an outsider, not just in politics, but in friendship, work, art, and even love. Because belonging isn't just about who you are anymore, it's about who you perform to be. The code is constantly shifting, new pronouns, new slogans, new flags, new sins, and if you don't keep up, if you miss an update, if you ask a question at the wrong time, you're suspect. The system doesn't just want you to behave, it wants you to display. And that pressure to constantly narrate your identity, to update your moral status, to prove your position, is psychologically exhausting, and worse, spiritually empty. So some people opt out, they disappear, they go silent online, they avoid social events, they stop speaking honestly, they say less, feel less, shrink themselves into ambiguity, not because they have nothing to say, but because they know that saying the wrong thing or nothing at all is enough to destroy them. And this creates a society where the loudest voices dominate, not because they're the wisest, but because they are the most willing to conform and repeat and signal and perform. And beneath that noise, millions of silent minds live in exile, not for doing harm, but for refusing to pretend. The irony is that many of the greatest thinkers, writers, inventors, and reformers in history would not survive today's climate of identity orthodoxy. They were misfits, outcasts, paradoxes. They didn't fit into the binary logic of left and right, progress and tradition, victim and oppressor. They were not easily categorized. They thought slowly, doubted constantly, and lived uncomfortably. And today, that kind of person is considered a liability. The system doesn't want slow thinkers. It wants representatives, ambassadors, sloganeers, and so it trains people to identify as identities first and as individuals last. And maybe that's the goal. A world where everyone is sorted, where every behavior is tagged, where every thought can be predicted based on group membership. This is the algorithmic dream: personalization through profiling, efficiency through tribalism, profit through polarization. In such a world, ambiguity is friction, doubt is dangerous, not belonging is. The ultimate glitch. But the truth is, no one fully belongs, not really. Everyone is a contradiction. Everyone carries inside them a mess of beliefs, instincts, fears, desires, loyalties that shift from day to day. And that mess is beautiful, that mess is human. To erase that, to flatten people into roles, to punish them for not wearing the right intellectual costume, that is the true thought crime. Not what you think, but that you think differently. Not that you reject truth, but that your truth doesn't fit their system. So the next time someone asks you to declare, to pick a side, to prove your identity, to confess your place in the hierarchy, and you feel that silence rising in your throat, that hesitation in your chest, honor it. That silence might be the last honest part of you left, not because you don't care, but because you care enough to still be searching.